Picture a golden diadem passing through 1,000 winters, its jewels catching candlelight in smoky cathedral halls, while emperors kneel before altars stained with centuries of ambition. Imagine armies crossing alpine passes in endless procession, German knights descending toward Italian sun, papal banners fluttering against storm clouds, merchant princes counting coins while their cities burn. This is the saga of Europe's strangest creation, a realm that stretched from Baltic shores to Mediterranean ports, ruled by elected kings who called themselves Caesar while begging for papal blessing. Watch as Viking raids give birth to empires, as monastery bells ring out the death of dynasties, as a single crown creates both paradise and hell across a continent that never learned to be one thing or another. Here unfolds power's most beautiful contradiction, an empire built on the belief that heaven and earth could share a throne. The story begins not in gleaming marble halls or golden palaces, but in the dark forests of Francia, where autumn mist clings to oak and ash, like the breath of sleeping giants. Here, among warriors who measure wealth in cattle and swords, a dynasty rises that will reshape the very foundations of Western civilization. The year is 768, and two brothers divide a realm that stretches from the windswept shores of the Atlantic to the vine-covered hills of Burgundy. Charles and Charlemagne, sons of Pepin the Short, inherit more than mere territory. They receive the accumulated ambitions of a bloodline that has clawed its way from palace stewards to crowned rulers. Their grandfather, Charles Martel, earned his name Arch the Hammer by crushing Saracen armies at Tours, saving Christendom from the scimitar's edge. Their father seized the crown from the last feeble Merovingian, deposing monarchs whose royal blood had thinned to water, while Carolingian strength flowed like molten iron. But divided realms breed division, and the brothers eye each other across their shared borders, with the wariness of wolves circling the same prey. Carloman rules the eastern lands, Austrasia, Alemannia, and Thuringia, where Germanic traditions run deep as winter roots. His sibling commands the west, Neustria, Burgundy, and Aquitaine, regions where imperial ghosts still whisper from crumbling stones and Celtic mysteries linger in sacred groves. Tension breaks like a taut bowstring when Carloman dies suddenly in 771. His death as unexpected as spring frost. Some whisper of poison, others speak of divine judgment, but the future emperor wastes no time on speculation. Moving with the swiftness that will become his hallmark, he seizes his brother's inheritance before the corpse grows cold, scattering Carloman's supporters like leaves before an autumn gale. The Queen Mother Bertrada and her grandsons flee across the Alps to seek sanctuary with the Lombard sovereign, but their exile only clears the path for what follows. Now sole master of the northern lands, Charles reveals the ambition that burns in his breast like forge fire. The fragmented realm he inherits spans territories that once knew imperial order, but centuries of barbarian settlement have shattered that unity into countless feuding tribes and petty kingdoms. Where Caesar's legions once marched in perfect formation, now tribal warbands raid across unmarked borders. Where ancient law once brought peace, tribal customs clash like sword against shield. The frontier beyond the Rhine beckons with deadly allure. Past the river's dark waters stretch endless forests where pagan altars smoke with sacrifice. Where Wotan's ravens feast on believer flesh, where ancient gods demand blood tribute from any who dare carry the cross into their sacred shadows. For 3 centuries, these lands have resisted every attempt at conquest, swallowing imperial armies and expeditionary forces with equal hunger. The Carolingian king crosses the Rhine in 772 with an army that gleams like a river of steel under the morning sun. His warriors sing battle hymns as they march into shadows that have never known the light of Christ, their voices echoing off trees older than memory. At their head rides the young sovereign himself, his golden hair streaming from beneath a crown that catches fire in the slanting sunlight, his presence transforming rabble into a weapon of divine purpose. Irminsul's sacred grove looms like a defiant sculpture in oak, a living column that the tribal folk say holds up the vault of the sky. Here their priests perform rites that date to the world's morning, spilling blood on roots that have drunk the life of countless sacrifices. The conqueror orders the grove burned, and as the ancient timber crashes to earth in showers of sparks, the very foundations of resistance begin to crack. But trees may burn while roots remain alive in darkness. The chieftain Widukind emerges from the forest depths, like a wolf lord summoning his pack, his voice carrying across misty valleys to rouse every warrior who still honors the old ways. Under his leadership, the tribes unite as they never have before, transforming scattered raids into coordinated warfare that tests even Western resolve. The conflict stretches across 30 years of fire and blood, each season bringing fresh horrors. Prisoners face a choice starker than winter: baptism or death. Thousands choose the waters of salvation, but thousands more prefer the sword to submission, their defiance ending in mass executions that stain honor with innocent blood. At Verdun, in 782, 4,000 nobles meet their doom in a single day, their heads rolling like autumn apples, while priests chant prayers for the dead. Yet from this cruelty comes unexpected fruit. The survivors, broken by grief and terror, finally accept the Christ whose followers have proven more ruthless than any pagan deity. Churches rise where groves once stood, their bells calling barbarian souls to salvation, while garrisons ensure that backsliding meets swift punishment. Slowly, inexorably, the tribal lands bend to royal will, their ancient freedom traded for the peace that only absolute submission can bring. While northern blood feeds the German earth, the conqueror turns his gaze southward to Italy, where opportunity gleams like gold in a merchant's scales. The Lombard realm stretches across the peninsula's fertile heart, its capital at Pavia, commanding the trade routes that link northern Europe with the riches of Byzantium and the East. Desiderius rules there with the confidence of one whose ancestors conquered imperial provinces, but his confidence rests on foundations more fragile than he knows. The pontiff Hadrian sends desperate pleas across the Alps, his letters speaking of Lombard armies pressing against the very gates of the Eternal City, of churches plundered and pilgrims slaughtered, of the patrimony of St. Peter threatened by barbarian hands. The papal words carry more than mere political calculation. They invoke the ancient compact between Frank and Holy See, the alliance forged when Pepin the Short first answered ecclesiastical prayers for deliverance from Lombard steel. Charles responds with characteristic decisiveness. The Alpine passes that have guarded Italy since Hannibal's day cannot stop an army driven by divine purpose and royal ambition. Through the Mont Cenis pass comes a host that staggers even imperial imagination. 20,000 warriors, their mail gleaming like scales on some massive serpent, their banners snapping in mountain winds that carry the scent of distant vineyards and olive groves. The siege of Pavia unfolds like a masterwork of military engineering. The northern ruler surrounds the city with earthworks and palisades that transform investment into strangulation, cutting every road and river that might bring relief to the trapped defenders. Through the long months of blockade, hunger becomes the most reliable ally, gnawing at defender morale more effectively than any assault engine. When the gates finally open in 774, they reveal not conquest but transformation. The victor enters not as a barbarian destroyer, but as an imperial successor, his coronation as sovereign of the Lombards performed with ceremonies that echo ancient tradition. The iron crown of Lombardy settles on his brow like destiny made manifest, its weight carrying the accumulated authority of centuries. But Italy's true prize lies not in Pavia's treasury, but in the eternal city's ancient streets, where the successor of St. Peter waits to bestow blessings that monarchs cannot seize by force of arms. The entry into the ancient capital unfolds with pomp that recalls Constantine's triumph, northern warriors gaping at monuments that dwarf their imagination. Marble columns rise like frozen prayers toward heaven, while bronze emperors gaze down from pedestals worn smooth by centuries of supplication. Hadrian greets his champion with ceremonies that blend ecclesiastical humility and imperial grandeur. The kiss of peace passes between pontiff and sovereign, while crowds cry, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Yet beneath this sacred theatre lies calculation as cold as alpine snow. The papal authority gains a protector whose sword can enforce its will across Western Europe, while the conqueror acquires legitimacy that no amount of conquest could provide. The eastern frontier calls with different challenges, where Avar horsemen thunder across the Hungarian plain like storm clouds made flesh. These warriors of the steppes have terrorized Europe for 2 centuries, their mounted archers striking like lightning before vanishing into grasslands that swallow pursuit. Their ring fortresses rise from the earth like geometric mountains, each one protecting treasures gathered from 100 plundered cities. With the calm precision of a seasoned general, the king tackles this expedition like a man who's done it all before. No wild charges into trackless wilderness, no reliance on courage alone to overcome tactical disadvantage. Instead, he builds a network of fortified bases that creep eastward like the tide, each stronghold covering the next until Avar mobility counts for nothing against persistent advance. The Great Ring falls in 796 after a siege that lasts 3 seasons, its treasury disgorging wealth that staggers even contemporary chroniclers. 15 wagons drawn by 4 oxen each carry the golden harvest back to Aachen, where nobles marvel at Byzantine silks, Persian pearls, and coins that bear the faces of emperors dead for centuries. This plunder finances churches and palaces across the realm, transforming provincial courts into centers worthy of imperial ambition. Yet gold and glory pale beside the greater prize that awaits at century's end. Leo III occupies St. Peter's throne, with authority undermined by enemies who question both his legitimacy and his morals. Local nobles whisper of simony and worse, their accusations threatening to tear the ecclesiastical hierarchy apart when unity stands essential to survival. In desperation, the pontiff flees across the Alps to seek protection from the one man whose might can silence all opposition. At Paderborn in 799, a shift begins in Western Europe's power structure. Charles welcomes the fugitive pope as an equal, though their real exchange happens away from the public eye. Here, in chambers where no chronicler's pen can reach, the framework for a new order takes shape, a dominion that will unite Germanic strength with classical tradition under the banner of Christ triumphant. It's a pilgrimage in the shape of a campaign. The northern king leads his army across the Alps, overwhelming in strength. Yet when he reaches Rome, it's prayer, not power, that leads the way. He kneels at Peter's tomb, with tears streaming down his face, his devotion genuine despite the calculations that drive him southward. Christmas Day in the year 800, breaks grey and cold over ancient rooftops. But inside St. Peter's Basilica, warmth radiates from 1,000 candles that transform stone into gold. The congregation that gathers for the holy feast includes not only clerics and nobility, but northern warriors whose presence reminds all observers where true might lies in this reshuffled world. The moment itself arrives with theatrical precision that suggests careful planning, despite claims of spontaneity. As the king rises from prayer before the high altar, Leo steps forward with a diadem that gleams like captured starlight. Latin resounds through the ancient hall. Carolus Augustus, adeo coronatus, magnus et pacificus imperator Romanorum, vita et victoria. Charles the Augustus, crowned by God, mighty and peace-bringing emperor of the Romans, life and victory. When the crown meets his brow, it brings more than glittering splendor. It brings the full weight of empire and expectation. In this moment, the Western Dominion returns from the grave. After 3 centuries of sleep, its resurrection achieved not through conquest alone, but through the marriage of barbarian vitality with ecclesiastical purpose. The congregation's acclamation rises like thunder, proclaiming the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and peaceful emperor, bringer of life and victory. But even as the ceremonial shouts fade into memory, the new emperor feels the burden of what he has accepted. To wear the purple means more than ruling distant provinces or commanding vast armies. It means becoming the earthly representative of divine order, the sword of God in a world that teeters between civilization and chaos. The Iron Crown of Lombardy had made him a sovereign. This imperial diadem transforms him into something approaching a living saint. The immediate consequences ripple across Europe like earthquake tremors. In Constantinople, the Byzantine ruler Nicephorus reads reports of Western usurpation with fury that darkens the Golden Palace. How dare these barbarian upstarts claim titles that belong to the true heirs of Caesar and Augustus? The insult demands response, but practical considerations temper imperial wrath. Northern armies have proven their quality in too many battles to dismiss lightly. Diplomatic missions cross the Mediterranean and Black Sea as East and West negotiate a new balance of authority. After years of careful correspondence, Byzantium reluctantly acknowledges the Carolingian imperial title in exchange for recognition of Byzantine supremacy in the East. The compromise satisfies no one completely, but prevents the warfare that mutual hostility might have triggered. Within the new dominion, transformation accelerates beyond all expectation. Aachen becomes a northern capital where scholars gather to revive classical learning and scribes labor to preserve the wisdom of ages. The palace school attracts minds from across Europe. Alcuin of York brings Anglo-Saxon scholarship. Theodulf of Orleans contributes Visigothic learning, while Paul the Deacon carries the accumulated knowledge of Lombard monasteries. Under their guidance, education spreads like spring water through fertile ground. Monastic scriptoria become workshops of preservation, where monks copy everything, from Virgil's poetry to Augustine's theology. Their patient labor saving classical texts from the oblivion that has claimed so many ancient works. The Carolingian minuscule script they develop proves so superior to earlier hands that it becomes the standard for medieval manuscripts, its clarity ensuring that knowledge once preserved remains accessible to future generations. The cathedral school at Aachen echoes with debates that would have delighted Cicero's ghost. Young nobles study grammar and rhetoric alongside the sons of merchants and craftsmen, their education preparing them to serve a dominion that demands literacy from its administrators. Women too receive instruction in letters and music, their learning adorning courts where civilization blooms like flowers in a walled garden. Legal reform follows educational renewal, as the emperor seeks to impose uniform justice across his polyglot domains. The capitularies that flow from his chancellery address everything from trade regulations to moral conduct, their provisions reflecting determination to create order from chaos. Local customs yield gradually to imperial law, though regional variations persist where tradition runs too deep for royal commands to uproot. Economic transformation accompanies political revolution as trade revives under imperial protection. The silver denarius becomes a reliable medium of exchange from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, its weight and purity guaranteed by royal authority. Markets that had withered during the anarchic centuries bloom again, as merchants discover they can travel vast distances without fear of arbitrary taxation or brigandage. Agricultural innovation follows commercial revival as the three-field system spreads across regions that had known only primitive farming techniques. Heavy ploughs drawn by teams of oxen turned stubborn clay soils that lighter implements could never breach, while new crops like oats provide fodder for the horses that increasingly replace oxen in transportation and warfare. Population grows as food becomes more abundant, creating the demographic foundation for future expansion. Religious reform weaves through all these changes, like golden thread through rich tapestry. The emperor demands that his bishops live up to their spiritual responsibilities, rather than merely administering vast estates, while monasteries receive new rules that emphasize prayer and study over worldly concerns. The tithe becomes a universal obligation that funds construction and supports ecclesiastical education, creating the institutional framework that will sustain medieval devotion. Yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks appear that will eventually shatter imperial unity. The emperor's multiple marriages produce a bewildering array of heirs whose competing claims threaten the realm's integrity. Louis the Pious inherits his father's title, but not his strength, while younger sons receive domains that breed ambition instead of satisfaction. The succession crisis erupts into civil war before the great conqueror's bones grow cold in their Aachen tomb. Louis's attempts to preserve imperial unity collide with his brother's determination to carve out independent realms, their conflicts bleeding the dominion white, while external enemies probe weakened frontiers. Viking longships appear in rivers that had known only peaceful commerce, their crews discovering that wealth makes plunder more profitable than trade. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 acknowledges what force of arms has already decided. The great dominion must fragment into smaller realms if peace is to return. Louis the German receives the eastern lands that will become the Holy Roman Empire's heartland, while his brother rules the western regions that evolve into France. Between them lies the middle realm of Lothar, a geographic impossibility that stretches from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, but possesses no natural unity. This division plants seeds of conflict that will poison European relations for centuries. The German Louis and his Western counterpart eye each other across borders drawn more by exhaustion than logic, each seeking opportunities to expand at his rival's expense. Their descendants will fight over Lotharingia and Burgundy with a persistence that makes the Trojan War seem brief by comparison. In the eastern realm that becomes Germany, different challenges emerge as royal authority weakens and regional dukes assert their independence. The great duchies, Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Lotharingia, transform from administrative divisions into hereditary principalities whose rulers acknowledge royal supremacy with increasing reluctance. The centrifugal forces that the great emperor had held in check through personal charisma and military might begin pulling the realm apart like a rope under too much strain. The last two Carolingian emperors rule from increasingly hollow thrones as their authority evaporates like morning mist. The magnificent court at Aachen dwindles to a shadow of its former glory, while scholars and artists seek patronage elsewhere. The revival of learning continues in monasteries and cathedral schools, but imperial leadership fades as weak rulers struggle with problems that would have challenged stronger men. Charles, known to history as Charles the Fat, was deposed in 887, a moment that closed an era as surely as the fall of a great tree defines the edge of the forest. The assembled nobles who strip him of crown and dignity act not from mere ambition, but from recognition that the Carolingian system has outlived its usefulness. New times demand new solutions, new challenges require fresh approaches. Yet the achievement endures even as the dynasty perishes. The precedent of imperial coronation by papal hands establishes a pattern that will shape medieval politics for centuries. The ideal of a dominion uniting spiritual and temporal authority survives every dynastic change, inspiring successive generations of rulers and emperors to seek the crown that the great conqueror made glorious. The educational revival outlasts its imperial sponsors, as cathedral schools and monastic libraries preserve the classical heritage for future ages. The administrative techniques developed in Aachen chancelleries become standard practice across Europe, while the legal principles embedded in the capitularies influence law codes from England to Hungary. Most importantly, the marriage of Germanic vigor with classical tradition creates a new synthesis that defines Western civilization for the next millennium. Neither purely barbarian nor merely imperial, this hybrid culture combines the best elements of both worlds while transcending the limitations of either. In the monasteries where Celtic illumination meets learning, in the courts where German warriors appreciate Latin poetry, in the schools where barbarian nobles study classical rhetoric, the foundations of medieval Europe take shape. Power slips away, but the idea refuses to die. In the eastern lands that the great conqueror won from pagan darkness and nomadic horsemen, new rulers arise who claim inheritance of his legacy. The crown passes from the emperor's hands to different heads, but the imperial dignity survives transfer, carrying with it the accumulated authority of centuries. When Otto the Great seeks papal coronation in 962, he follows precedents established in St. Peter's Basilica more than a century and a half earlier. The holy realm that emerges from new ambition traces its legitimacy to Christmas Day 800, when a northern sovereign became an emperor through the blessing of Christ's vicar on earth. The wheel of fortune turns, as it always must, carrying dynasties to glory and doom with equal indifference. But the pattern established in the Carolingian age proves more durable than bronze or stone, outlasting the realms that created it, and inspiring the dreams of every ruler who seeks to unite Europe under a single crown. In this sense, the great achievement never truly dies. It simply changes hands, passing from Frank to German to whatever people prove worthy of its weight. In the hush of morning mist, the bells of Aachen still sound, echoes of imperial grandeur carried on bronze tones that outlast forgotten rulers. In their music lives the memory of the Christmas morning, when East and West were reunited, when barbarism yielded to civilization, when the crown of Caesar found a head worthy to bear its golden burden. The dominion passes, but the dream endures, waiting for hands strong enough to lift it once again. From the ashes of Carolingian unity rises a world transformed, where the great edifice built by the conquering emperor crumbles into fragments that glitter like shards of a broken mirror. 5 great duchies stand like ancient oak trees, their roots deep in tribal soil, their branches reaching toward independent skies. Saxony in the north guards sea winds that carry salt and freedom. Franconia, at the heart, keeps old royal traditions alive. Swabia in the southwest watches Alpine passes and Italian dreams. Bavaria in the southeast inherits Celtic mysteries and tribal lore. Between them lies Lotharingia, the disputed borderland where cultures meet and mingle, like waters at a confluence. These stem duchies emerge not as administrative conveniences, but as living embodiments of ancient peoples whose dialects carry centuries of weight, whose customs predate Christianity itself. Each becomes a kingdom in all but name, ruled by magnates whose bloodlines stretch back to tribal chieftains who elected war leaders beside sacred springs. The very structure that will define medieval Germania takes shape from these regional powers, creating the foundation for centuries of struggle between central control and local independence. Arnulf of Carinthia seizes the eastern fragments in 896, his coronation marking the last gasp of Carolingian legitimacy. Yet even this shadow monarch cannot restore what has been lost. When death claims him in 899, his child heir Louis dissolves into obscurity while stronger hands reach for the abandoned throne. The interregnum breeds chaos like infection, exposing Germanic lands to predators who have waited centuries for such opportunity. Across the Carpathian passes sweep horsemen, like wolves descending from winter mountains, their curved sabers flashing as they harvest German gold and blood with equal enthusiasm. These nomad warriors, heirs to Attila's legacy, transform the Hungarian plain into a staging ground for terror, their swift ponies carrying destruction from Baltic shores to Italian foothills. Village after village burns under their torches, while monastery treasuries empty into their saddlebags. Chronicles record the lamentations of a people who thought themselves beyond the reach of steppe fury. The raiders strike like lightning, sudden, devastating, gone before defenders can organize pursuit. Their name alone becomes a prayer for mercy, deliverance from the Hungarian scourge. This nomadic threat defines a generation of Germanic politics, spurring military and political reforms that will reshape Europe. Into this maelstrom steps Henry the Fowler, Duke of Saxony, whose name speaks to humble origins. His father found him mending bird nets when messengers brought news of his election as monarch. Beneath rustic simplicity burns intelligence sharp as winter steel, patience deep as northern forests, and cunning that would have impressed Odysseus himself. The great nobles gathering at Fritzlar in 919 choose not scholarship but survival, not piety but pragmatism. Before them stand the accumulated failures of divided rule, the smoking ruins of nomad raids, the bitter knowledge that disunity means death. They need not a scholar prince who quotes Virgil while barbarians burn his cities, but a warrior who understands that survival demands steel before scripture. The Fowler accepts their allegiance with characteristic calculation, his first acts revealing the methodical mind that will save Germania from dissolution. Where predecessors sought to rule through grand gestures, this Saxon builds strength foundation by foundation, alliance by alliance, victory by victory. He begins with what he can control and expands outward only when circumstances permit, like a prudent merchant who counts his coins before making purchases. The strategy proves revolutionary in its patience, transformational in its effects. Negotiating truce with nomad chieftains in 924 shocks contemporaries with apparent cowardice. To pay tribute to pagan horsemen burns like acid in Germanic pride, yet calculation reaches beyond immediate shame toward ultimate triumph. The 9-year peace, purchased with gold, buys something more precious. Time to transform Saxon farmers into soldiers. Time to build fortifications that will turn nomad mobility into deadly disadvantage. Across his domains, the Fowler constructs a network of burgs that rise from earth like stone prayers to the god of war. Each stronghold follows careful patterns, thick walls that laugh at nomad arrows, deep wells that mock siege tactics, granaries storing enough grain to outlast winter itself. Around each burg, he settles populations who combine farming with fighting, creating a revolutionary synthesis of agriculture and warfare. Revolutionary innovation creates new warriors from Germanic raw material. Heavy cavalry emerging from training grounds represents fusion of Roman discipline with barbarian ferocity. Mounted fighters who can charge like Huns, but stand like legionnaires. Their horses, bred for strength rather than speed, carry armored men whose iron shirts turn arrows, and whose long lances punch through leather shields like needles through cloth. Breaking again in 933, the steppe storm crashes against defenses transformed beyond recognition. At Riyadh, the Saxon monarch unleashes his war machine with devastating effect. Nomad horsemen who terrorized Europe for a generation discover that ancient tactics fail against enemies who learned their lessons well. Eastern arrows rattle harmlessly off mail, while northern lances reach hearts with surgical precision. Slaughter becomes so complete that chroniclers struggle for adequate words. Thousands of bodies carpet the battlefield like autumn leaves, their blood darkening German soil that will know no more invasions from eastern steppes. Survivors flee across Carpathians with news that will echo in their songs. The Germans have learned to fight. This victory transforms not merely tactics, but the entire balance of European politics. Triumph reverberates far beyond immediate battlefield. Across Germania, nobles who bent knees to nomad demands straighten their backs with renewed pride. The fowler who mended bird nets has proven that Germanic valor, properly organized and intelligently led, can match any threat from the world's dark corners. Success breeds ambition. Victory enables expansion. Internal challenges multiply even as external threats diminish. Great duchies that elevated the Saxon regard his growing strength with increasing suspicion. Eberhard of Franconia plots rebellion, while Bavarian magnates whisper of independence around mountain strongholds. The very system that produced royal elevation contains seeds of its own destruction. Responding with methodical patience, the monarch allows enemies to reveal themselves fully before striking with overwhelming force. When Eberhard raises banners in open revolt, the response comes swift as avalanche. The rebel duke dies with Saxon steel between his ribs, supporters scattered like chaff before wind. The message resonates across Germania. This ruler will not be challenged lightly. Bavaria proves thornier, its mountain passes and ancient customs creating natural barriers. Yet even here, combination of force and diplomacy eventually prevails. When Arnulf the Bad submits in 938, his surrender brings access to alpine passes that guard routes to Italy, routes essential to future ambitions. Each victory builds momentum for greater conquests. Greatest achievement lies not in any single triumph, but in institutional framework created for future greatness. Innovations establish patterns, defining medieval warfare for centuries. Fortification systems provide defensive backbone, enabling successors to launch offensive operations across vast distances. Balance struck between central control and ducal independence creates political structures flexible enough to survive strains that shattered Carolingian unity. Death, claiming the Fowler in 936, passes the throne to a son, inheriting accumulated momentum of generational construction. Otto stands poised to transform regional monarchy into something far grander. Yet the path runs through fires, testing every lesson taught, every alliance forged, every institution built. The stage stands set for achievements that will dwarf even paternal accomplishments. Assemblage at Aachen witnesses ceremonies blending Germanic tradition with Carolingian memory as Otto receives the diadem Charlemagne wore. Coronation in the ancient capital sends messages resonating across Europe. Saxon lines claim legitimacy as Carolingian heirs. Germanic peoples stand ready to resume their continental role. Chaos following earlier collapse has ended with new strength rising. Coronations create rulers only in ceremony. Real tests come when royal will encounters ducal resistance across battlefields where men die for barely understood causes. The new sovereign's reign begins with rebellions, sprouting like weeds after rain, as brothers, dukes, and ambitious magnates test resolve with naked steel. Family proves no barrier to political necessity. His own brother leads the first revolt, rebellion burning across Saxony like wildfire through dry timber. Irony cuts deep. The duchy producing royal lines now bleeds in civil war as sibling fights sibling. Yet response reveals ruthless calculation lurking beneath Saxon pragmatism. When familial loyalty collides with royal necessity, necessity wins without hesitation. Struggle unfolds across familiar landscapes of childhood, through forests where both brothers once hunted deer, past rivers where they learned to swim and dream of infinite futures. Now those woodlands echo with war cries, as siblings seek each other's death with dedication, others reserve for prayer. The personal becomes political, the political becomes existential. Victory at Andernach in 939 crushes rebels with methodical efficiency, making their father proud. The brother escapes carnage, but defeat establishes reputation as a sovereign who will spill family blood when duty demands sacrifice. The message resonates. This monarch cannot be intimidated by blood ties or ancient loyalties. Fear becomes the foundation of respect. Consolidating grip on internal affairs, the ruler faces external threats gathering like storm clouds. Nomadic menace, contained but not eliminated, lurks beyond Carpathian passes, where ponies stamp and warrior chiefs dream of German gold. To the west, France nurses Carolingian memories of unity under Frankish rule. Southward, Italy fragments into competing factions, creating opportunity and danger. Italian situations prove particularly tempting. The peninsula that anchored Charlemagne's dominion writhes in chaos as regional strongmen carve petty kingdoms from Carolingian corpses. Lombard nobility chafe under weak successors who cannot maintain order. Their appeals reach the Saxon court like siren songs promising glory, gold, and legitimacy to any monarch strong enough to restore unity. Approaching peninsular involvement with paternal caution, the sovereign understands Italy remains a graveyard of royal dreams, its political complexity capable of entangling armies effectively as any marsh. He bides time, building strength while watching with hunters' patience. Opportunity comes disguised as romance, duty wrapped in desire. Moment arrives in 951, when Adelheid, widow of Italian monarch Lothair, sends desperate appeals for protection against Berengar of Ivrea. Romance stirs Saxon imagination. A beautiful queen in distress. Opportunity for chivalrous intervention, combining duty with desire. The expedition unfolds like triumphant procession rather than hostile operation. Italian nobles groaning under Berengar's oppression welcome Saxon liberators with enthusiasm approaching worship. City gates open without siege. Treasure flows into northern coffers without battle. resistance melts like snow in spring sunshine. Marriage between the Saxon and Adelheid, celebrated in Pavia, creates more than personal union. It forges links between northern strength and Italian legitimacy. The appeal of Italy is undeniable at first, its charm masking the thorny legacy it leaves for those who follow. Every intervention breeds need for further intervention. Every victory requires additional victories to secure what has been won. The peninsula becomes a beautiful trap, alluring, but ultimately destructive. Crisis erupting in 955 demonstrates perils and opportunities of expanding commitments. While Saxon attention focuses on Italian affairs, nomad raiders strike deep into Germanic territory, with renewed fury, testing whether the monarch can defend homeland while maintaining southern conquests. The moment of ultimate testing arrives with mathematical precision. Lechfeld expedition becomes the defining moment of the reign, the crucible where royal pretensions either transform or dissolve in defeat's acid. Everything stakes on single battle. Not merely Italian gains, but paternal legacy, dynastic future, and Germanic independence survival. Two civilizations meet in mortal combat. Armies converging embody worlds locked in struggle. Eastern hosts carry accumulated fury of nomad peoples terrorizing sedentary populations since time immemorial. Their ponies bred for endurance, compound bows punching arrows through mail at incredible distances. Mobility tactics refined through conquest centuries. Against them stands the war machine the Fowler created and his son perfected. Battle unfolds with brutal clarity, marking great historical turning points. Steppe arrows darken sky like locust clouds, iron points seeking gaps in mail with deadly precision. Yet Germanic lines hold firm, shields locked in formations, transforming individual warriors into machine components. When heavy cavalry unleashes in earth-shaking charges, nomad resistance shatters like glass against stone. Slaughter following exceeds even paternal victory in completeness. Bodies carpet fields so thickly, chroniclers describe Earth as black with blood, while survivors flee eastward in panic, many drowning attempting desperate river crossings. The nomad threat, haunting Europe for generations, dies beneath swords in single afternoon of perfect carnage. Triumph reverberates across the known world, like thunder rolling over mountains. From Scandinavia to Spain, from Ireland to Byzantium, courts receive news with wonder approaching disbelief. The monarch who began fighting rebellious brothers has ended the menace conquered. Peoples accepted as unchangeable existence. Success opens doors previously barred. Victory's immediate consequences transform Germanic political reality with shocking speed. Dukes who chafed under royal rule now compete for favor with servile enthusiasm. Prestige flowing from Lechfeld makes resistance seem suicidal. Who would oppose a sovereign whose armies destroy forces terrorizing Europe for generations? Success breeds greater ambition. Papal appeal, arriving in 961, provides final catalyst for transformation. Pope John XII, besieged in Rome by Berengar's forces and threatened with capture, sends desperate pleas for protection earlier pontiffs sought from Charlemagne. The parallel proves irresistible. Here stands opportunity to claim legitimacy as heir to the great conqueror's legacy. Descent into Italy in 961 unfolds with seasonal inevitability. War machine crushing nomads proves equally effective against Italian opposition, while diplomatic alliances smooth every advanced step. Berengar's forces dissolve like mist before Saxon professionalism. The path to glory lies open. Coronation in St. Peter's Basilica on February 2nd, 962. recreates ceremony, elevating Charlemagne with modifications reflecting changing circumstances. Pope John places diadem on the Saxon's head with trembling hands. The pontiff understands he creates not merely a ruler, but a master whose strength will overshadow papal independence for generations. Acclamation, echoing through ancient basilica, sounds like history's voice itself speaking across centuries. Yet participants understand this ceremony creates obligations binding as the diadem is heavy. The new emperor accepts responsibility not merely for defending Rome, but governing the chaotic peninsula consuming so many royal ambitions. Death claiming the great Saxon in 973 leaves behind dominion, spanning from Elbe to Tiber, from North Sea to Alps. His achievement transforming fractious duchies into coherent systems equals anything Charlemagne accomplished while establishing tactical doctrines influencing European warfare for centuries. The throne passes to sons who inherit both glory and its burdens. Subsequent reigns demonstrate both promise and peril of Italian involvement. The second ruler's Byzantine marriage elevates Saxon dynasty while importing court ceremonials, sitting uneasily with Germanic customs. Southern expeditions bring conflict with both Byzantine interests and Saracen raiders, culminating in disaster at Crotone that shatters Saxon invincibility aura. Slavic revolt erupting beyond Elbe demonstrates how quickly expansion reverses when prestige falters. Tribes accepting Saxon overlordship for generations rise in coordinated rebellion, fury fed by accumulated resentment. Strongholds built as permanent conquest symbols burn while garrisons meet slaughter. The third ruler's reign unfolds like fever dreams, grandiose visions of Roman renewal clashing with realities mocking classical restoration attempts. Educated by Byzantine tutors, he attempts ruling from Rome itself, transforming ancient capital into new Constantinople. Roman revolt destroys dreams, forcing flight from beloved capital. Direct Saxon line ends in 1002. Succession crisis exposing institution fragility. Henry II's election restores stability through compromise, characterizing Germanic political culture. The new ruler possesses sufficient royal blood, claiming legitimacy, while lacking strength, completely dominating magnates. Administrative innovations create frameworks enabling survival through dynastic transitions. Hungarian expeditions complete transformation, beginning with Lechfeld victory. Former nomad warriors settle into sedentary agriculture under monarchs accepting Christianity and European customs. Death claiming the ruler, childless, in 1024, passes throne to Conrad II, first Salian dynasty member. The new sovereign's reign marks expansion, beginning reaching zenith under successors. Burgundian inheritance brings territories stretching from Rhine to Mediterranean, while Italian interventions restore jurisdiction. Governmental innovations strengthen royal control while creating institutions outlasting dynasties. Henry III's accession in 1039 brings monarchy combining piety with political skill, surpassing anything since the first Saxons' time. Achievements restoring papal dignity while maintaining supremacy demonstrate delicate balance characterizing successful medieval statecraft. Synod of Sutri in 1046 reveals both height of royal control and eventual limitation seeds. Even as the third Salian reaches zenith, forces gather challenging everything Saxon and early Salian rulers built. Movements his piety encourages begin questioning fundamental assumptions underlying royal policies. Voices arise speaking of clerical independence from secular control, of leadership transcending temporal dominion. Succession crisis following unexpected death in 1056 exposes the realm to pressures mature institutions might have contained. Regency lacks personal strength. Strong monarchs use maintaining political balance, while reformed papacy begins asserting claims challenging royal prerogatives. The stage stands set for the greatest constitutional crisis in Germanic history. Emerging controversy represents more than disputes over appointments. It embodies fundamental questions about governance nature itself. Struggle beginning as disagreement will escalate into civil war threatening the realm's very existence, testing every institution built through 2 centuries of careful construction. Thunder begins not with armies clashing, but with a quill scratching across parchment in Lateran chambers. Pope Gregory VII, born Hildebrand of Sovana, whose iron will burns hot as Tuscan forges, sets down words igniting 50 years of civil war. His Dictatus Papae reads like revolution, disguised as religious guidance. Each line stripping away compromises binding temporal and ecclesiastical powers since Charlemagne's time. The decrees are clear and uncompromising. The Pope alone may depose bishops, wield sovereign symbols, command princes to kiss his feet, and dethrone kings. He stands beyond judgment, the Roman See flawless and eternal. These words linger in the autumn air like incense, signaling the end of royal dominance in spiritual affairs and the rise of a new age where popes lay claim to the souls of monarchs. Distant Germanic lands receive these pronouncements with disbelief, crushing young Henry IV's worldview. At 25, the Salian possesses youth's pride, amplified by dynastic dignity worn for generations. His father had appointed pontiffs like household servants, control over ecclesiastical affairs absolute as dominance over temporal matters. Now this reforming prelate dares claim sacred oils make mortals superior to anointed kings. Crisis engulfing ruler and territories grows from roots planted during childhood. When the future king assumed the throne at 6, while regency exposed every weakness, strong leaders concealed through personality force. Great nobles who bowed before paternal strength now test royal boundaries, with water's persistence seeking stone cracks. Archbishop Anno of Cologne seizes the young ruler's person in 1062 through protective custody, kidnapping that removes the child from maternal influence. Education following shapes a leader bearing permanent humiliation marks, absorbing betrayal lessons and bitter knowledge that strength alone commands respect where weakness invites predation. Seeds planted during minority bloom into paranoia and ruthlessness characterizing adult rule. The boy who should have learned statecraft learns instead the art of survival among predators. Hildebrand emerges from monastic renewal ferment like a prophet armed with divine wrath and political genius equally. Rise through administration demonstrates religious dedication combined with practical cunning, enabling movements transforming idealistic dreams into political reality. Norman conquest of southern Italy provides him with alliances making ecclesiastical independence viable. Robert Guiscard offering swords to causes legitimizing conquests. Assuming the papal throne as Gregory VII in 1073, Hildebrand brings visions of ecclesiastical supremacy transcending predecessor attempts. Innovations target not merely obvious abuses like clerical marriage, but fundamental relationships between temporal and religious leadership governing European politics since Constantine's conversion. Revolution envisioned will either establish supremacy over earthly rulers or destroy the papacy attempting it. Dictatus of 1075 Marx theory transforming into practice, abstract claims becoming concrete challenges to royal prerogative. The pontiff's assertion that religious leaders may depose rulers strikes at system hearts the Salian inherited from ancestors, while lay appointment prohibition threatens severing bonds, making royal control over Germanic territories possible. Battle lines form across Europe like armies preparing for eternal war. Initial response reveals traditional royal dominance's strength and limitations in changing expectation ages. Synod of Worms in January 1076 assembles Germanic and Italian prelates, whose royal appointment loyalty outweighs Roman displeasure fears. Their formal deposition of the reforming pontiff represents system last gasps, where rulers treated religious leaders like removable officials rather than spiritual guides. Counterattack comes with devastating swiftness, catching the young king unprepared for the pontiff's response speed. February 1076. Excommunication unleashes forces tearing the territories apart like lightning splitting ancient oaks. Spiritual thunderbolt separating ruler from believer community also releases subjects from loyalty oaths, transforming legitimate resistance into holy obligation, blessed by heaven itself. Excommunication's psychological impact reverberates through society, where salvation matters more than earthly comfort. Nobles who might have supported kings against mere political opponents find themselves confronting choices between anointed ruler loyalty and Christ's vicar obedience. When stakes involve eternal punishment, even hardened warriors discover prudence counsels abandoning lost causes for spiritual safety. Saxon uprising, erupting in response to Roman encouragement, reveals accumulated resentments, successful royal governance suppressed rather than eliminated. Northern Duchy, producing the line, becomes resistance center. Ancient liberties, reviving like flowers after winter's end. Habsburg fortress falls to rebel assault with shocking speed, demonstrating how quickly established might crumbles when legitimacy dissolves into theological condemnation. Germanic princes gathering at Treber in October 1076 represent more than feudal nobles seeking political advantage. They embody constitutional crisis threatening fragmentation. Their ultimatum demands absolution within 1 year or royal deposition, collective will overriding individual dynastic loyalty. Leadership seeming unshakable during earlier triumphs discovers ecclesiastical censure accomplishes what nomad arrows failed achieving through decades of warfare. Situation grows desperate with each passing week as former allies distance themselves from rulers whose excommunication taints associations. Christmas court, traditionally showcasing royal magnificence, attracts only handful supporters whose loyalty reflects personal desperation rather than confident allegiance. The king finds himself isolated in his own territories, abandoned by those who once competed for his favor. Decision-seeking forgiveness represents most humiliating retreat in history. Surrender so complete its memory will haunt royal dignity for generations. Alpine journey in winter demonstrates both desperation, depth, and residual strength, enabling such perilous expedition. Small party struggling through snow-blocked passes includes only most devoted supporters, men whose fate intertwines with their king's survival. Approaching the Alpine fortress unfolds like pilgrimage wrapped in political calculation, each step carrying ruler closer to salvation and simultaneous humiliation. The stronghold becomes stage for drama, resonating through European politics centuries. Within walls waits the reforming pontiff, armed with ecclesiastical dominance proving more devastating than earthly weapons forged in any smithy. 3 days spent outside fortress gates, standing barefoot in snow while wearing only penitents' rough wool, create images chroniclers struggle describing with adequate dignity. Ruler claiming inheritance from Augustus and Charlemagne reduces himself to common supplicant posture, royal bearing stripped away until only naked humanity remains. Yet even ultimate humiliation contains calculation. Absolution will restore legitimacy while providing future revenge opportunities. Absolution ceremony, finally admitting penitent, demonstrates the pontiff's theatrical politics mastery, each gesture emphasizing ecclesiastical supremacy, while offering just enough royal dignity, making submission palatable. Kiss of peace, passing between religious leader and temporal ruler, marks not reconciliation, but temporary truce in struggle, transcending personal animosity, involving fundamental questions about governance itself. Even achieving immediate communion restoration goal, future discord seeds take root in present humiliation soil. Ruler who knelt before ecclesiastical dominance will never forget that subjugation taste, just as the pontiff granting mercy will always remember royal submission came from necessity rather than conviction. Peace proves fragile as winter ice, beautiful but treacherous. Return to Germania reveals how little absolution accomplishes healing civil war wounds. Saxon rebels, expecting Roman support, find themselves abandoned by the pontiff, whose forgiveness serves broader political purposes. Yet resentment burns too hot for calculations extinguishing, investment in uprising too deep for abandonment without concrete gains that justify years of bloodshed. Rudolf of Rheinfelden's election as anti-king in March 1077 represents aristocratic resistance culmination, formal opposition, crystallization, excommunication made possible. Duke, whose loyalty once seemed unshakable, now wears crown challenging legitimacy while providing focus for all seeking royal prerogative limitation. The territories face unprecedented competing rulers, whose rival claims tear political unity fabric apart. Civil war engulfing Germania for 3 years exceeds previous experience bitterness, brother fighting brother, while ancient friendships dissolve in competing loyalty acid. Battles raging across Saxon plains pit former allies against each other, with fury transcending mere political disagreement approaching religious warfare. Each side claims divine sanction, while denouncing opponents as enemies of both God and state. The pontiff's renewed excommunication in 1080 provides spark-igniting most destructive phase, ecclesiastical weapons combining with secular force, creating devastation exceeding external enemies' achievements. Declaration that the Salian forfeited throne through unworthiness gives constitutional legitimacy to resistance while transforming political uprising into holy war, blessed by heaven itself. Ulster battle in October 1080 becomes crucible where competing claims receive ultimate tests. Rudolf's melee death, sword hand severed by blows, contemporaries interpret as divine judgment, ends alternative kingship while providing victory, seeming to vindicate cause through combat trial. Yet triumph comes at terrible cost that nearly bankrupts royal resources. Germanic triumph comes at prices creating resentments festering like untreated wounds. Nobles submitting to renewed dominance do so with reservations, making future loyalty conditional upon royal restraint. Allegiance purchased through concessions, weakening the very leadership they ostensibly support. Constitutional balance tilts decisively toward aristocratic independence, while reducing royal prerogatives to shadows. Italian expedition of 1081 represents attempts resolving crisis through direct action against sources, armies crossing Alps with determination settling by force what negotiation failed accomplishing. Siege transforms eternal city into battlefield, where ecclesiastical and temporal dominance clash with weapons more earthly than theological arguments initiating struggle decades earlier. 3 years spent reducing Roman resistance demonstrate both tradition, persistence, and force limitations against opponents possessing more than material resources. Each ancient wall assaulting counters, resistance stiffened by conviction, transcending mere political loyalty. Romans discovering unexpected courage, defending St. Peter's Air against Germanic invaders, seeking to impose will through violence. Clement III's installation in 1084 represents attempts solving ecclesiastical crisis through same methods predecessors used. Germanic-sponsored candidate appointment whose legitimacy derives from temporal dominance rather than canonical election. Yet world-enabling earlier rulers treating the papacy as subordinate institution has vanished, replaced by expectations making imposed solutions temporary expedients rather than permanent resolutions. Norman intervention, driving besiegers from the Eternal City, demonstrates how fundamentally Italian politics' balance shifted. Robert Guiscard's advance forces, abandoning siege while providing the reforming pontiff with protection, ecclesiastical dominance alone could not guarantee. Rescue comes at terrible prices, as Norman soldiers transform the ancient capital into wasteland of burned structures and plundered palaces. When the exiled pope dies in Salerno in 1085, the movement loses its boldest voice, but not its momentum. What he built outlives him, entrusted to heirs burdened by both his ideals and the opposition they sparked. His dying sentiment, a reflection on justice and exile, reflects the solemn price paid for a transformation that forever altered Europe's political landscape. Swabian succession crisis demonstrates how deeply civil war fragmented traditional inheritance patterns. Duchy providing stable leadership becomes prize contested by rivals whose claims rest more on strength than legitimate succession. Frederick of Staufen's emergence marks new politics phase. Marriage to royal daughter creating dynastic alliances, reshaping future developments across Germanic territories. Urban II's election in 1088 brings papal throne man whose diplomatic skills exceed predecessor while maintaining ecclesiastical independence commitment. Careful religious leadership reconstruction demonstrates how institutions survive even devastating defeats. When fundamental principles find continuing support among influential constituencies willing to sacrifice for spiritual causes. Clermont Council in 1095 reveals Urban's genius, transforming defensive necessity into offensive opportunity. First Crusade proclamation, providing leadership with cause transcending local political struggles. Enthusiastic response demonstrates that ecclesiastical dominance over temporal rulers has taken root in ways making purely military solutions inadequate for resolving fundamental constitutional questions. Absence from crusading movement isolates the Salian from his age's most significant undertaking. Excommunicated status, preventing participation in enterprise, providing other rulers unprecedented prestige. King claiming Christendom's defender finds himself excluded from Christianity's greatest adventure. Isolation becoming political marginalization that undermines traditional sources of legitimacy. Uprising of rulers' own sons represents ultimate consequence of policies prioritizing immediate advantage over long-term stability. Conrad's coronation as Italian king in 1093 creates unprecedented situation of reigning leader whose designated heir actively opposes dominance, struggle tearing apart succession planning, providing monarchies institutional continuity across generations. Final humiliation witnesses in Diet of Mainz. In 1106, as younger son, forces old rulers' abdication through military pressure, making continued resistance futile. Ceremony transferring crown to Henry V marks era ending when rulers could treat ecclesiastical leadership as subordinate, while beginning new age of negotiated cooperation between competing forms of governance. Death in 1106 removes ruler whose rule encompassed both ambition heights and constitutional crisis depths. King beginning as absolute leader dies as fugitive from own son's armies, fate illustrating how quickly established dominance crumbles when legitimacy evaporates under spiritual condemnation and political pressure combined. Henry V's succession brings throne ruler inheriting impossible task, resolving struggles generational warfare only intensified. Initial attempts continuing paternal policies encounter resistance from nobles. Learning royal dominance has limits. Conditional loyalty forcing modifications in traditional expectations built over centuries of successful governance. Roman expedition of 1110 demonstrates attempts resolving crisis through same combinations predecessors employed, yet changed circumstances make traditional solutions increasingly ineffective. Dramatic confrontation at St. Peter's Basilica in 1111, where the new king seizes Pope Paschal II during supposed coronation ceremony, represents ultimate frustration expression and political miscalculation. Desperate gamble extracting concessions through physical coercion backfires catastrophically, transforming him from legitimate ruler into kidnapper, violating civilized behavior's basic norms. Privilege Paschal grants under duress provides only temporary advantage before denunciation renders it worthless, demonstrating how violence undermines rather than strengthens political positions. Lateran Council of 1112 formally condemns coerced privilege while reasserting supremacy in religious matters. Assembled prelates providing institutional backing for positions transforming individual policies into permanent ecclesiastical law. Unanimous support reveals how completely movement captured leadership imagination across Europe, creating irreversible precedents. Calixtus II's emergence as pontiff in 1119 brings papal throne man, whose diplomatic experience enables negotiation from strength rather than weakness. Willingness, seeking compromise, preserving essential prerogatives, while acknowledging legitimate interests creates resolution possibilities absent during previous negotiations conducted under pressure of warfare and excommunication. Preliminary agreements reached at Mouzon in 1119 establish framework ultimately resolving crisis through careful distinction between religious and temporal dominance. Würzburg Congress in 1121 provides venue where representatives hammer out detailed provisions, transforming general principles into specific agreements acceptable to both sides after decades of fruitless warfare. Concordat of Worms, signed September 23, 1122, represents more than particular dispute resolution. It establishes constitutional principles governing temporal and ecclesiastical leadership relationships for centuries. Careful language distinguishing between appointment with ring and staff reserved to religious leadership and appointment with regalia permitted to royal control creates practical solutions satisfying essential requirements. Henry V's renunciation of appointment with religious symbols removes most visible lay control manifestation, while preserving influence over material resources, making effective governance possible. Concession, permitting appointment with regalia, acknowledges practical necessity of royal involvement, while maintaining principle that religious leadership derives from ecclesiastical sources rather than temporal appointment. Peace descending upon territories following Concordat carries transformations extending far beyond immediate settlement terms. Constitutional principles, established through 50 years, struggle create new relationships between royal dominance and aristocratic independence, central control and local autonomy that will define medieval European political development for centuries. Strengthened Germanic noble position represents perhaps most significant long-term consequence. Enhanced independence, creating foundation for territorial principalities, dominating later history. Victory, establishing clerical independence, creates precedents influencing relations throughout European civilization. Principles achieving institutional embodiment, surviving particular personalities and political circumstances through institutional memory. Yet peace price proves steep for institution, emerging from crisis, weakened in dominance and diminished in prestige. Leadership, once appointing pontiffs, now negotiates with them as equals, while nobles, once serving as royal officials, increasingly function as independent rulers, whose cooperation cannot be commanded but must be purchased through concessions. Holy Roman territories, emerging from crisis, bear little resemblance to institution. Earlier rulers created transformation, reflecting broader European political culture, changes favoring negotiated cooperation over imposed dominance. Institution survives constitutional crisis, but emerges fundamentally altered. Future development constrained by precedents established through bitter struggle lasting half a century. Speyer Cathedral bells toll across Rhine Valley, bronze voices carrying ambition echoes through territories remembering both glory and agony of the age. In solemn music lives memory of rulers claiming dominance over temporal and religious spheres alike. Only discovering some forms of control cannot be seized by force or maintained through coercion alone. Born from crisis, the new dynasty does more than govern. It recasts the very nature of power. When Lothar III dies childless in 1137, the German princes face a choice that will echo through centuries. Between Conrad of Hohenstaufen, nephew of the last Salian ruler, and Henry the Proud of Bavaria, whose wealth bloodline stretches back to Charlemagne's own courtiers. The election that follows fractures Germanic politics along lines that run deeper than mere personal ambition, creating the great schism between Staufer and wealth that will define medieval European warfare. Conrad III assumes the throne in 1138 as first of his house to wear the diadem, yet his reign proves merely prologue to greater dramas ahead. The new sovereign inherits territories still bleeding from decades of warfare, where princes have learned that royal commands carry weight only when backed by overwhelming force. Bavaria falls to prolonged siege. Henry the Proud dies in exile, but the fires of dynastic rivalry merely smolder rather than extinguish completely. Across the Alps, opportunities beckon with seductive promise. Northern peninsular communes writhe under local tyrants whose petty kingdoms mock the very concept of legitimate governance. Religious politics fragment between competing factions, while Roman nobles tear the eternal city apart in pursuit of ancient grudges. The land that once anchored Charlemagne's dominion now resembles a chessboard, where every piece moves according to different rules. Yet Conrad's attention turns eastward toward the Holy Land, where Crusader kingdoms teeter on the edge of collapse before resurgent Islamic forces. The Second Crusade consumes Germanic energies in futile expeditions across Anatolian wastes, thousands of knights perishing in desert heat, while peninsular opportunities slip away, like sand through grasping fingers. Disaster compounds political weakness, leaving the crown diminished in prestige just as dynastic transition approaches. Death claims Conrad in 1152, his passing opening the throne to his nephew Frederick, Duke of Swabia, whose very person embodies the synthesis of warring bloodlines. Through his mother, Judith of Bavaria, flows wealth heritage that makes him acceptable to formerly rebellious nobles. Through his father flows Staufer determination that will transform this genealogical accident into the foundation for unprecedented achievements. At 28, the new ruler possesses the physical presence of a born warrior, combined with intellectual sophistication. Contemporary chroniclers struggle to capture his imposing figure. Tall as a lance, broad as a shield, with hair so golden that sunlight seems to emanate from his very presence. His voice carries across battlefields like thunder over mountains, while his strategic mind dissects problems with surgical precision. Most remarkably, the reddish beard that gives him his sobriquet Barbarossa frames features that blend Germanic strength with Latin refinement, as if Providence designed him specifically to bridge cultural divides. Coronation at Aachen in 1152 witnesses ceremonies, deliberately echoing Charlemagne's own elevation, the new leader claiming inheritance from the great conqueror, while adapting ancient forms to contemporary necessities. Barbarossa's early edicts reveal a mind obsessed with concepts of honor, justice, and dignity that transcend mere territorial possession. He envisions rulership not as feudal overlordship, but as something approaching divine mission, the restoration of order to a world torn apart by petty ambitions. Initial challenges test this grand vision against harsh political realities. Wealth opposition crystallizes around Henry the Lion, son of Henry the Proud, whose control over Saxony and Bavaria makes him virtually co-sovereign within the Germanic territories. Rather than crushing this potential rival through force, the new ruler demonstrates diplomatic genius by transforming enemy into ally through calculated generosity. The Bavarian receives confirmation of his dual duchies in exchange for service. Such domestic tranquility enables focus southward, where peninsular affairs cry out for resolution. The Lombard communes of northern regions, Milan, Brescia, Piacenza, Cremona, have grown rich through trade with Byzantine and Islamic merchants, their wealth enabling independence that mocks traditional concepts of subordination. These urban republics govern themselves through consuls elected by citizen assemblies, their prosperity built on commercial innovation rather than feudal agriculture. More troubling still, these communes dare to claim political equality with anointed rulers, their legal scholars citing Roman precedents to justify municipal independence. The very concept strikes at fundamental assumptions about political hierarchy. If mere merchants can govern territories through popular consent, what distinguishes crowned heads from ambitious commoners? The challenge transcends peninsular affairs to threaten the entire structure of medieval order. Barbarossa's first descent across the Alps in 1154 unfolds like a masterpiece of diplomatic theatre, combined with strength demonstration. The army that winds through Alpine passes includes not merely German knights, but contingents from across the territories. Swabian crossbowmen, Bavarian cavalry, Saxon infantry, creating a display of united might designed to overawe potential opposition before violence becomes necessary. Milan receives the embassy with arrogance that borders on insult. The commune's consuls treating crowned majesty as merely another diplomatic correspondent rather than divinely appointed superior. Their merchants calculate that demands for tribute threaten commercial profits, while their legal advisors argue that municipal charters grant autonomy equivalent to royal prerogative. The collision between these incompatible worldviews makes conflict inevitable. Siege warfare in northern regions reveals both the strengths and limitations of traditional methods against innovative urban defenses. Milanese engineers have learned lessons from crusader accounts of Islamic fortress construction. their walls incorporating improvements that render conventional assault tactics ineffective. Months of investment achieve little beyond demonstrating that rich communes can hire mercenary defenders whose loyalty persists as long as payment continues. Yet the German ruler possesses resources beyond mere force. His legal advisors, scholars trained in the renewed study of Roman law at Bologna's famous schools, provide intellectual weapons more devastating than siege engines. They argue that royal power derives directly from ancient precedents established by Augustus and Justinian, making municipal claims to independence not merely treasonous, but historically absurd. The renovation of law becomes a weapon of dominance, more subtle than swords. This legal offensive culminates in the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158, where Barbarossa formally proclaims the revival of classical prerogatives. The assembly reads like a catalogue of powers that would have impressed Caesar himself: the right to appoint municipal magistrates, control of major trade routes, supervision of legal proceedings, collection of all significant revenues. The proclamation transforms communes from independent republics into administrative districts of a renewed dominion. Implementation proves more challenging than proclamation. Milanese defiance hardens into desperate resistance as citizens recognize that submission means the destruction of everything that has made their commune great. Popular assemblies vote resources for extended warfare, while merchant families liquidate overseas investments to fund preparations. The transformation of prosperous burghers into determined soldiers demonstrates how existential threats can forge unity from unlikely materials. Destruction of Milan in 1162 becomes a cautionary tale told across Europe for generations. After 2 years of siege, starvation finally accomplishes what assault could not, opening gates that had resisted armies through sheer stubborn endurance. The response reveals calculated cruelty that marks peninsular policy, not the hot rage of a frustrated warrior, but the cold justice of a sovereign determined to establish precedents that will discourage future defiance. The citizens who once boasted of their municipal liberties march into exile, carrying only what they can bear, while engineers systematically demolish walls, towers, and public buildings that had symbolized civic independence. The cathedral, where archbishops celebrated municipal triumphs, becomes rubble scattered across fields where wheat will grow over the graves of republican dreams. Even the commune's name disappears from official documents, replaced by generic references to the place where Milan once stood. Yet destruction breeds unexpected consequences. Across northern regions, surviving communes recognize that submission offers no guarantee of survival, while harsh justice transforms local grievances into movements of universal opposition. The League of Verona, formed in 1164, represents something unprecedented in medieval politics. An alliance of urban republics united not by feudal obligation, but by shared commitment to principles that transcend particular localities. Religious politics complicate designs with webs of intrigue that would challenge Machiavelli himself. The schism following disputed election in 1159 creates competing pontiffs. Victor IV, backed by Germanic support. Alexander III, sustained by French and English recognition. Support for Victor represents more than mere preference. It embodies visions of ecclesiastical hierarchy subordinated to temporal will, reversing gains achieved during the Investiture controversy. Alexander III's exile to France transforms religious opposition into international coalition against Germanic ambitions. The French court welcomes the fugitive pontiff not from altruism, but from calculation. Supporting ecclesiastical independence serves Capetian interests by constraining Staufer expansion. English involvement follows similar logic. Henry II, recognizing that success across the Alps might encourage continental adventures threatening Angevin territories. Formation of the Lombard League in 1167 marks the moment when peninsular opposition achieves institutional form capable of sustained resistance. 23 communes contribute troops, resources, and diplomatic support to an alliance that consciously models itself on ancient precedents while adapting classical forms to contemporary needs. Their chosen name honors the Germanic tribes who once humbled Roman legions, yet their methods reflect urban sophistication that surpasses anything achieved by barbarous ancestors. Strategic innovation characterizes league preparations. Rather than attempting to match forces in conventional battlefield encounters, Allied commanders developed tactics exploiting urban advantages while minimizing weaknesses. Fortified camps connected by protected communication lines create networks that armies cannot sever without dividing their own forces dangerously. Citizen militias prove surprisingly effective when fighting for homes and families, rather than abstract feudal obligations. The economic warfare proves equally innovative. League communes coordinate trade boycotts that starve Germanic territories of essential supplies, while their own merchants develop alternative routes through religious states and Norman Sicily. Commercial alliances with Byzantine and Islamic traders provide resources for extended opposition, while demonstrating that municipal independence serves broader economic interests than territorial subordination. Response reveals both the strengths and limitations of traditional royal methods confronting revolutionary challenges. Germanic armies remain superior in conventional encounters, German knights proving their worth repeatedly against Lombard infantry. Yet superiority cannot solve political problems when enemies refuse decisive battle while controlling territories too extensive for permanent occupation by foreign forces. The disaster at Legnano in 1176 shatters pretensions with stunning finality. On the muddy fields outside the small Lombard town, heavy cavalry, the formation that has dominated European battlefields for centuries, breaks against disciplined pike squares supported by crossbow volleys that turn individual heroism into collective suicide. Barbarossa himself narrowly escapes capture when his personal guard dissolves under pressure that transforms elite warriors into fleeing refugees. News of defeat spreads across Europe like wildfire, encouraging opposition movements from Normandy to Hungary, while demonstrating that Germanic superiority rests on foundations less solid than previously assumed. Within the territories, Henry the Lion's refusal to provide assistance during peninsular expeditions takes on new significance as princes calculate whether supporting adventures serves their own interests rather than dynastic glory. Peace negotiations at Venice in 1177 force acknowledgement of realities that force cannot alter. Recognition of Alexander III as legitimate pontiff reverses decades of ecclesiastical policy, while accepting religious independence that the Investiture controversy had established only in principle. The Lombard communes receive confirmation of their municipal liberties in exchange for formal recognition of overlordship, a compromise that satisfies neither side completely, but enables both to claim partial victory. Yet the peninsular obsession continues drawing energies southward, despite repeated demonstrations of its futility. Marriage alliance with the Norman Kingdom of Sicily represents the culmination of dynastic diplomacy that sacrifices German interests to Mediterranean ambitions. When Henry VI marries Constance of Sicily in 1286, the union promises to encircle religious territories while creating a dominion stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Realization of these ambitions awaits Barbarossa's death during the Third Crusade in 1190. His drowning in the Salif River, removing from the stage a ruler whose vision had consistently exceeded his ability to achieve practical implementation. The army that had followed him toward the Holy Land dissolves into competing factions, while his corpse, preserved in vinegar for transport home, becomes a symbol of reaching beyond mortal limitations. Henry VI inherits both crown and impossible responsibilities. His reign dominated by attempts to consolidate gains his father achieved through decades of warfare. Norman administrative methods, adapted from Byzantine and Islamic models, enable efficient extraction of revenues that dwarf anything achieved in Germanic territories. Yet success breeds new challenges that traditional methods cannot address. The union of Germanic and Sicilian crowns creates a dominion too vast for personal rule, while cultural differences between northern warriors and southern bureaucrats generate tensions that threaten institutional cohesion. Attempts to make succession hereditary rather than elective encounter resistance from German princes, who recognize that change might permanently diminish their own influence over royal selection. Death claims Henry VI in 1297 at the age of 32, his passing precipitating crisis that tears the realm apart just as earlier disputes had done. The infant Frederick II inherits Sicilian titles, while competing candidates divide Germanic territories between Staufer and Welf claimants. Civil war resumes with renewed fury, as old grievances combine with new ambitions to create conflicts that consume another generation of warriors and resources. Otto IV of Brunswick represents Welf hopes for dynastic restoration, his coronation by religious support demonstrating how ecclesiastical politics continue influencing transitions. Yet his attempts to control both Germanic territories and peninsular possessions encounter the same problems that had frustrated Staufer predecessors. The fundamental contradiction between northern feudalism and southern centralization admits no easy resolution through personal charisma or force alone. Religious support proves as fickle as weather when Otto's ambitions threaten ecclesiastical independence that previous pontiffs had died defending. Innocent III's excommunication of his former protégé demonstrates how institutional interests transcend personal relationships, while backing for young Frederick II reveals calculated statecraft that sacrifices immediate advantages for long-term gains. Frederick II's minority unfolds against background of continued warfare that devastates territories already exhausted by generations of dynastic conflict. Sicily serves as sanctuary, where the young ruler absorbs influences that will shape his revolutionary approach to governance. Norman traditions, Islamic scientific knowledge, and Byzantine ceremonial forms combine in his education to create perspectives that transcend traditional European limitations completely. Coming of age in 1208, the new sovereign demonstrates precocious understanding of political complexities that had baffled adult predecessors. His early correspondence reveals intellectual sophistication that impresses even hostile observers, while his innovations suggest familiarity with governmental methods unknown to conventional feudal practice. The youth who inherits fractured territories possesses tools that might enable him to transform institutional failure into unprecedented success. Yet the challenges awaiting exceed even remarkable capabilities. German princes have learned during the interregnum that royal weakness enables aristocratic independence, while peninsular communes have discovered that municipal leagues can preserve liberties against foreign armies. The papacy has perfected techniques for manipulating dynastic rivalries to serve ecclesiastical interests, while French and English monarchs stand ready to intervene whenever consolidation threatens their own ambitions. Establishing himself in Sicily, Frederick II creates the most advanced governmental system in medieval Europe. His constitutions of Melfi establish legal codes that rival anything produced by Roman jurists, while his bureaucracy operates with efficiency that amazes contemporary observers. The kingdom becomes a laboratory for political experimentation that combines Islamic administrative methods with Byzantine ceremonial traditions and Norman practical experience. Cultural achievements flourish under royal patronage as scholars from across the known world gather at Frederick's court. The palace at Palermo becomes a center of learning that rivals ancient Alexandria, where Arabic texts receive translation into Latin, while Greek manuscripts find preservation for future generations. The ruler himself participates in intellectual discussions that range from mathematics to philosophy, his correspondence with Islamic scholars demonstrating interests that transcend conventional religious boundaries. Yet these southern achievements come at the cost of northern alienation. German princes grow increasingly resentful of a ruler who seems more interested in Sicilian experiments than Germanic traditions. The contrast between the sophisticated court culture of Palermo and the rough feudal customs of northern territories creates cultural tensions that political arrangements cannot resolve. What begins as practical governance evolves into fundamental incompatibility between different concepts of rulership itself. The struggle with Gregory IX epitomizes these irreconcilable differences. The pontiff views Frederick's secular approach to governance as a fundamental threat to religious authority, while the ruler sees ecclesiastical interference as an obstacle to rational administration. Their conflict transcends personal animosity to embody the collision between medieval theocracy and emerging concepts of secular sovereignty that will define future European development. Multiple excommunications follow as religious and temporal powers clash over fundamental questions about the nature of legitimate government. Each pronouncement strengthens opposition within the Germanic territories while providing foreign enemies with justification for intervention. The ruler who sought to create universal dominion finds himself increasingly isolated, his very achievements becoming sources of weakness rather than strength. The Siege of Parma in 1248 demonstrates how completely circumstances have changed since earlier Staufer triumphs. What should have been a routine reduction of rebellious commune becomes a disaster that shatters remaining pretensions to universal rulership. The defeat reveals that even the most sophisticated governmental methods cannot overcome political realities when fundamental legitimacy comes under sustained challenge from multiple directions simultaneously. Frederick II's death in 1250, at the age of 56, marks the end of the last serious attempt to create universal sovereignty in medieval Europe. His passing removes from the stage the most gifted ruler of his age, whose intellectual achievements and governmental innovations had promised to transform the entire structure of European politics. Yet his failure demonstrates that individual genius cannot overcome institutional limitations when structural contradictions admit no resolution. The interregnum that follows reveals how completely the Staufer dynasty has exhausted itself in pursuit of impossible ambitions. No credible candidate emerges to claim inheritance of Frederick's titles, while his legitimate heirs lack either the resources or the political support necessary to maintain even fragments of his dominion. The great dream of universal sovereignty dies with its last serious practitioner, leaving Europe fragmented among competing national monarchies. Peninsular communes celebrate their liberation from Germanic overlordship, while German princes rejoice in their escape from southern entanglements. The fundamental incompatibility between northern feudalism and southern bureaucracy, between Germanic warrior culture and Mediterranean sophistication, between universal ambitions and practical limitations, finally receives acknowledgement through complete institutional separation. The bells of Palermo Cathedral toll across Sicilian hills, their bronze voices carrying echoes of vanished grandeur through territories that remember both the promise and the failure of universal rule. In their solemn music lives the memory of the last ruler who dared to claim dominion over both temporal and spiritual spheres, only to discover that some dreams exceed even the most extraordinary human capabilities to achieve lasting realization. Silence falls over Germany like a shroud when news arrives that Frederick II has breathed his last in distant Apulia. The man who called himself Wonder of the World lies dead at 56, his dreams of universal dominion crumbling to dust in Sicilian soil. For the first time in 4 centuries, no clear successor emerges to claim the crown that Charlemagne made glorious, leaving the territories adrift in political chaos that will reshape European civilization itself. Vultures gather with unseemly haste around the corpse of Staufer power. Pope Innocent IV, who had branded the late ruler as Antichrist incarnate, now proclaims jubilant thanksgiving services across Christendom, while secretly maneuvering to ensure that dynastic strength dies with its greatest representative. French diplomats whisper promises in princely ears, their golden coins speaking more eloquently than any theological argument about the benefits of fragmenting Germanic unity. Conrad IV attempts to salvage something from dynastic wreckage, but the young heir inherits only the southern kingdom of Sicily, plus a handful of loyal retainers whose devotion cannot substitute for the resources that effective leadership demands. His death in 1254, at the age of 26, extinguishes the last legitimate male descendant, leaving only the infant Conradin, whose Sicilian exile places him beyond German political calculations entirely. Anarchy spreads across the territories like plague through overcrowded towns. Without royal leadership to mediate disputes, ancient grievances explode into open warfare as local lords settle scores that prudence had previously restrained. Trade routes become battlefields where merchant caravans face bandits wearing noble arms, while peasant villages burn beneath the hooves of cavalry, whose only law derives from strength of sword and lance. Regional strongmen carve out petty kingdoms from the chaos, their ambitions limited only by neighboring rivals' ability to resist encroachment. Archbishop Werner of Mainz transforms his ecclesiastical domain into a militarized state where cathedral spires rise alongside siege towers, while Margrave Henry of Meissen expands eastward into Slavic lands whose previous inhabitants flee or submit to colonization programs administered through calculated brutality. Yet even amid this dissolution, institutional memory persists among those who remember what unified leadership once accomplished. The great lords who had chosen previous rulers understand that complete fragmentation serves no one's long-term interests, particularly when French and English monarchs grow stronger through centralized governance, while Germanic territories tear themselves apart through particularist ambitions that benefit only immediate neighbors. Tentative negotiations begin among the most powerful territorial magnates, their discussions focusing not on restoring Staufer pretensions, but on creating new arrangements that acknowledge political realities while preserving minimal institutional unity. These conversations reveal how profoundly concepts of legitimate governance have evolved since Otto I's time, when royal power derived from divine appointment rather than aristocratic consent freely given. Rudolf of Habsburg emerges from these deliberations as an unlikely candidate, whose very obscurity recommends him to lords fearful of creating another overmighty sovereign. Count of a modest Swiss territory, possessor of scattered holdings throughout southwestern regions, Rudolf represents competence without threatening ambition, the perfect choice for nobles who want royal coordination of their affairs, without royal domination of their independence. Election at Frankfurt in 1273 marks the end of the Great Interregnum and the beginning of a new phase in Germanic political development. The ceremony itself reveals how thoroughly traditional concepts have been transformed by 2 decades of institutional experimentation. Where previous coronations emphasized divine sanction and hereditary right, Rudolph's elevation rests explicitly on aristocratic choice, exercised through procedures that emphasize negotiation rather than acclamation. Practical governance proves more challenging than ceremonial innovation. The new ruler inherits lands that have grown accustomed to local autonomy, their lords interpreting royal restoration as an opportunity to gain external support for their own ambitions, rather than as a return to centralized administration. Each request for assistance comes with conditions that further limit royal prerogatives while expanding princely independence. The Burgundian inheritance through marriage provides Rudolf with resources that enable him to reward supporters while punishing opponents. Yet these additional lands also create new obligations that stretch limited administrative capacity beyond effective limits. The death of Ottokar II of Bohemia in 1278 opens opportunities for expansion eastward, but success in acquiring new territories means accepting responsibility for governing populations whose languages and customs remain alien to experience. Dynastic policies begin transforming the system into hereditary principality, as Rudolf systematically places family members in positions that enable long-term dominance. His sons receive duchies and counties, whose strategic importance transcends their immediate value, creating power bases that will survive failures while establishing precedents for treating royal resources as family patrimony, rather than public trust. Politics grow increasingly sophisticated as lords learn to balance competing interests through alliances that serve particular objectives, while maintaining flexibility for future negotiations. The death of Rudolf in 1291 triggers the first test of these new procedures, as territorial magnates weigh claims against the advantages of choosing different candidates who might prove more amenable to aristocratic influence. Adolf of Nassau wins through promises that reveal how completely the balance between royal power and princely independence has shifted since Staufer times. The new ruler pledges to avoid foreign adventures, respect territorial boundaries, and consult regularly with the great lords whose support maintains his position. These commitments transform the diadem from an instrument of personal ambition into an office whose occupant serves primarily as coordinator of aristocratic interests. Commercial revolution parallels political transformation, as the territories develop economic relationships that transcend traditional feudal boundaries. The Hanseatic League creates trading networks that span from Novgorod to London, their merchant princes wielding influence that rivals territorial nobility, while demonstrating how wealth can substitute for inherited status in determining political outcomes. Urban populations grow increasingly important as sources of both taxation and military service. Technological innovation accelerates social change through developments that alter fundamental relationships between different classes and regions. Improved agricultural techniques increase population density while generating surpluses that support larger non-farming populations. Water-powered mills and early mechanical devices boost manufacturing capacity, creating new forms of wealth that challenge traditional assumptions about the sources of political power and social status. Religious upheavals compound political instability as the papacy enters its own crisis of legitimacy through the Avignon exile that begins in 1309. Germanic ecclesiastical hierarchy finds itself divided between competing loyalties, while struggling to maintain spiritual leadership amid secular chaos. Monastic communities retreat into contemplative isolation, abandoning their previous roles as advisors and administrators to temporal rulers who increasingly govern through lay bureaucracies. Such procedures crystallize into formal arrangements through the famous document promulgated by Charles IV in 1356. This remarkable charter represents the culmination of a century's worth of experimentation with power-sharing arrangements, creating institutional frameworks that will govern Germanic politics for the remainder of the medieval period, while establishing precedents that influence European development far beyond territorial boundaries. 7 prince-selectors receive formal recognition as the exclusive arbiters of royal succession. 3 ecclesiastical, the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and 4 secular, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia. Each possesses clearly defined territories within which their power rivals that of the ruler himself, creating a system of shared sovereignty that acknowledges political realities while preserving institutional unity. Procedural innovations ensure that selections follow predictable patterns, while preventing the manipulation that had characterized earlier transitions. The famous charter specifies meeting locations, voting procedures, and timeline requirements that transform potentially chaotic assemblies into orderly conventions. Most importantly, the document establishes the principle that majority decision binds all participants, preventing minorities from disrupting outcomes through violence or appeals to external forces. Charles IV's own background exemplifies the international character that Germanic politics has acquired through territorial fragmentation and dynastic intermarriage. Educated in Paris, fluent in multiple languages, familiar with governmental practices from England to Hungary, he represents a new type of ruler whose power derives from diplomatic skill rather than military prowess. His court becomes a center of cultural patronage that attracts scholars and artists from across Europe. Bohemian resources enable the Luxembourg sovereign to pursue policies that his purely Germanic predecessors could never have afforded, while his cultivation of relationships with Italian and Flemish traders provides revenues that reduce dependence on territorial taxation. The famous charter reflects this sophisticated understanding of power relationships, creating structures that accommodate diverse interests while maintaining sufficient central coordination to prevent complete dissolution. Yet institutional innovation cannot resolve fundamental tensions between universal ambitions and particular loyalties that have plagued rulers since Charlemagne's time. The very success of territorial consolidation creates power centers that rival central leadership, while generating resources that enable sustained resistance to unwelcome interference. Each of the 7 great lords rules domains that function as sovereign states in all but name. Luxembourg dominance reaches its zenith under this accomplished ruler's leadership, yet even he cannot solve problems that transcend individual capabilities. His death in 1378 passes the diadem to Wenceslaus, whose alcohol-fueled incompetence demonstrates how quickly the new system can produce unsuitable candidates, when dynastic legitimacy no longer provides automatic qualification for office. Deposition of Wenceslaus in 1400 establishes the precedent that selectors can remove rulers who fail to fulfill their obligations, creating a form of limited rulership that anticipates later democratic developments while maintaining aristocratic control over political processes. The selection of Rupert of the Palatinate represents triumph of procedural legitimacy over hereditary claims, though his reign proves too brief to test whether reforms can overcome structural weaknesses. Hussite revolution in Bohemia reveals how spiritual dissent can exploit political fragmentation to threaten the entire order. Jan Hus's challenge to ecclesiastical leadership resonates with populations who have grown skeptical of all traditional institutions, while his martyrdom at the Council of Constance transforms theological dispute into nationalist uprising that combines social revolution with doctrinal reformation in ways that anticipate later Protestant developments. Military campaigns against Hussite forces demonstrate both the strengths and limitations of the new arrangements. Cooperation enables the mobilization of substantial armies that individual lords could never field independently. Yet the need for consensus prevents the decisive action that might crush rebellion before it spreads beyond Bohemian borders. Compromise emerges as the only viable solution to conflicts that military force cannot resolve. Economic disruption spreads throughout Central Europe as warfare interrupts relationships that had developed over generations of peaceful exchange. The Hanseatic network suffers particularly severe losses as overland routes become too dangerous for regular use, while urban populations face starvation when rural producers cannot deliver agricultural surpluses to market towns. Social tensions increase as different classes blame each other for hardships that affect entire populations. Sigismund's long reign, from 1410 to 1437, encompasses both the height of the new system's achievements and the beginning of its decline toward irrelevance. His success in resolving the Great Schism through the Council of Constance demonstrates how Germanic leadership can still influence European affairs when properly coordinated. Yet his inability to suppress Hussite rebellion reveals the system's incapacity for decisive action when fundamental interests conflict. Cultural patronage flourishes during this period as competing courts seek to demonstrate their sophistication through artistic commissions and scholarly enterprises. Gothic architecture reaches new heights of complexity as cathedral builders experiment with engineering techniques that push stone construction to its practical limits. Literary production expands as vernacular languages gain respectability for serious artistic expression rather than merely popular entertainment. Universities multiply across the territories as lords compete to attract scholars whose reputations enhance their own prestige, while providing trained administrators for increasingly complex governmental tasks. Legal studies particularly benefit from this competition, as Roman law revival provides intellectual frameworks for justifying territorial autonomy, while canon law study offers alternative approaches to questions that secular authorities cannot resolve independently. Technological development accelerates through the introduction of printing, which revolutionizes both governmental administration and popular communication. Official documents can now be reproduced in multiple copies with unprecedented accuracy, while pamphlets and broadsides enable rapid dissemination of political arguments that bypass traditional hierarchical channels. The democratization of information begins processes that will ultimately transform European political culture entirely. Yet these cultural and technological achievements cannot disguise the fundamental weakness that the new system has created through its success in limiting central power. The very institutional arrangements that prevented tyrannical abuse also preclude effective action when external threats require coordinated responses. French expansion eastward proceeds unchecked, while Ottoman armies advance through the Balkans, their progress facilitated by Germanic inability to mount sustained opposition. With the ruler's death in 1437, Luxembourg dominance comes to a close, making way for the resurgence of a family whose roots reach back 2 centuries. Yet the house that returns to prominence bears little resemblance to their 13th century ancestors. 2 centuries of political evolution have transformed Germanic leadership from personal dominion into office, while territorial consolidation has created power centers that operate independently of central coordination, except when mutual interests dictate temporary cooperation. The diadem that passes to Albert II represents both continuity and transformation. Continuity in that familiar dynastic names continue to dominate political discourse, transformation in that the substance of royal power has been fundamentally altered through institutional innovation that acknowledges practical limitations while preserving ceremonial dignity. The medieval Reich survives, but in forms that would have seemed impossible to Otto I or Frederick Barbarossa. Merchant guilds exercise influence that rivals territorial nobility in urban centers, where wealth has created new forms of political organization. Craft associations regulate economic activity through procedures that emphasize collective decision-making rather than hierarchical command, while trading companies operate across political boundaries through law that transcends territorial jurisdictions. Economic integration proceeds despite political fragmentation. Regional alliances emerge as alternatives to central coordination when the system proves incapable of addressing particular problems that affect multiple territories. The Swabian Alliance and similar organizations demonstrate how shared interests can generate institutional cooperation, even when arrangements provide inadequate frameworks for collective action. These experiments in federalism anticipate later developments that will reshape European political organization entirely. The realm that enters the 15th century bears only superficial resemblance to the universal dominion that Staufer rulers had envisioned. Yet this transformation represents adaptation rather than failure. As territories develop arrangements that acknowledge political realities while maintaining sufficient unity to preserve cultural identity and institutional memory, the dream of universal rule dies. But something equally valuable takes its place: a system of shared governance that anticipates modern federal democracy. Church bells ring across hundreds of small domains, their bronze voices carrying different messages, but harmonizing in ways that suggest underlying unity beneath surface diversity. In this polyphonic chorus lives the promise of a new kind of political organization that derives legitimacy from popular consent rather than divine appointment, that achieves coordination through negotiation rather than coercion, that preserves local autonomy while maintaining common identity. The medieval Reich prepares for transformation into something unprecedented in human experience. Dawn breaks over a transformed Europe in 1438 as Albert II assumes the Germanic diadem, beginning nearly unbroken dynastic control that will endure for centuries. Yet this restoration carries little resemblance to the personal dominion that earlier houses had wielded. The crown Albert inherits represents coordinating leadership rather than commanding sovereignty, ceremonial dignity rather than practical dominance over lands whose lords have learned to prize their independence above all else. Tragedy strikes swiftly when Albert dies of dysentery in 1439, after ruling barely 2 years. His premature death, leaving only an unborn heir, whose posthumous birth as Ladislaus creates a regency crisis that exposes every weakness in the evolving system. The infant's simultaneous inheritance of Hungarian and Bohemian thrones demonstrates how dynastic politics have created a web of relationships spanning half of Europe, yet also reveals how personal rule struggles to manage domains whose peoples speak different languages. Frederick III emerges from this chaos as perhaps the most unlikely ruler in Germanic history, a man whose greatest talent lies not in warfare or diplomacy, but in patient survival through crises that would have destroyed more ambitious personalities. His 53-year reign becomes an exercise in strategic passivity, watching enemies exhaust themselves while slowly accumulating advantages through marriage alliances and careful resource management that transforms apparent weakness into unexpected strength. Burgundian inheritance transforms the landscape when his son Maximilian marries Mary of Burgundy in 1477, their union bringing the richest regions in northern Europe under family control. The Low Countries' wealth dwarfs anything generated by traditional agricultural economies, while their urban populations have developed governmental techniques that challenge conventional feudal arrangements. This marriage creates a realm that spans from the North Sea to the Adriatic, yet also imports conflicts with France that will dominate European affairs for generations. A wave of cultural revival carried northward from Italy by merchants and diplomats begins to transform the Germanic world. Artistic innovation and intellectual ferment reach princely courts, where classical learning becomes a symbol of refinement. Humanism takes root, and with the advent of movable type, ideas spread rapidly across borders, reshaping both elite culture and public discourse. When Maximilian ascends in 1493, he inherits limited means but possesses a boundless imagination. His reign is marked by administrative reforms that attempt to bring coherence to centuries of accumulated privileges and patchwork governance. The Reichsreform seeks to impose order without alienating regional powers. At the same time, Maximilian elevates marriage diplomacy into a fine art. Through carefully arranged unions, he encircles France and plants the seeds of a global empire. His son's marriage to Joanna of Castile joins Germanic strength with Spanish wealth, while his own matrimonial ties secure claims in Hungary and Bohemia. The saying that Austria wins through weddings, not wars, captures a strategy that turns bloodlines into instruments of empire. Ottoman expansion creates existential threats that force Germanic cooperation despite institutional fragmentation. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 brings Islamic armies to the gates of Christendom, while Hungarian defeats at Mohacs in 1526 open the path for Turkish advance toward Vienna itself. These external pressures create common interests that transcend local rivalries, yet also reveal how the evolved system struggles to mount coordinated responses when survival itself hangs in the balance. Charles V inherits in 1519 a realm that spans continents, yet lacks institutional unity sufficient to govern effectively across such vast distances. Spanish domains in the Americas generate unprecedented wealth, while Netherlands' commerce provides revenues that dwarf traditional agricultural taxation. Yet this global reach creates obligations that strain both financial resources and administrative capacity beyond sustainable limits, forcing constant choices between competing priorities in widely separated theatres. Doctrinal revolution erupts when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses in 1517. His challenge to ecclesiastical practices igniting controversies that quickly transcend theological boundaries to become movements threatening the entire European order. Luther's German translation of the Bible creates new possibilities for popular participation, while undermining traditional hierarchical relationships between clergy and laity. The printing press transforms local disputes into continent-wide debates that escape all attempts at conventional control. Diet of Worms in 1521 witnesses the confrontation between universal realm and individual conscience that will define the century ahead. The Saxon monks' refusal to recant before assembled leaders demonstrates how spiritual conviction can challenge even the most imposing pressure, while his protection by Frederick the Wise of Saxony reveals how local independence enables resistance to central demands. The declaration of the Reformer as an outlaw creates the legal framework for doctrinal warfare. Lutheran princes discover in Reformed doctrine not merely spiritual liberation, but justification for resistance to traditional rulers whose legitimacy had seemed divinely ordained. The League of Schmalkalden, formed in 1531, represents something unprecedented, an alliance explicitly organized around theological principles rather than dynastic or regional interests. These spiritual alliances transcend conventional boundaries while creating new forms of solidarity that challenge existing governmental arrangements. Administrative institutions attempt to manage doctrinal division through legal mechanisms designed for secular disputes rather than spiritual differences. The Chamber Court and Aulic Council find their traditional procedures inadequate when confronted with disagreements that involve fundamental questions about the nature of truth itself. Legal precedents developed for property disputes prove useless when applied to conflicts about salvation and divine will that admit no earthly resolution. Doctrinal warfare devastates Germanic lands as theological disputes transform into military campaigns that blur distinctions between spiritual conviction and dynastic ambition. The Schmalkaldic campaigns of 1546 to 1547 demonstrate how spiritual unity fragments under pressure of competing interpretations, while military victories fail to resolve underlying disagreements that continue festering beneath apparent settlement. Augsburg's settlement in 1555 represents a revolutionary compromise that acknowledges doctrinal division as a permanent feature of Germanic life, rather than a temporary aberration to be corrected through force. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, allows regional rulers to determine their subjects' spiritual allegiance, creating a crazy quilt of confessional boundaries that reflects geographical rather than theological logic. This solution preserves institutional unity while accepting spiritual fragmentation. Yet Augsburg's limitations become apparent as new movements emerge that fit poorly within its binary framework. Calvinist regions find themselves legally excluded from protections designed for Lutheran and Catholic areas, while Anabaptists and other radical groups face persecution from all established leaders. The compromise that seemed to resolve doctrinal disputes proves incapable of accommodating the continued evolution of spiritual movements that refuse to accept officially sanctioned options. Ferdinand I's partition of the family lands in 1556 creates parallel branches that will compete for influence while sharing common interests in maintaining dynastic prominence. The Spanish line controls global domains that generate enormous wealth, yet require constant military expenditure to defend against enemies ranging from Ottoman fleets to English privateers. The Austrian branch focuses on Central European affairs, where Ottoman pressure creates immediate security concerns. Artistic transformation accompanies fragmentation as different regions develop distinctive characteristics that reflect their spiritual allegiances and economic relationships. Catholic areas emphasize Baroque splendor and hierarchical organization, while Lutheran regions cultivate simpler aesthetic approaches and more egalitarian social arrangements. These differences reinforce divisions while creating new forms of identity that transcend traditional dynastic loyalties. Educational innovation flourishes as competing communities establish schools and universities designed to train clergy and administrators in their respective traditions. Jesuit colleges emphasize classical learning combined with Catholic doctrine, while Lutheran academies develop curricula that stress individual interpretation of Scripture and practical preparation for secular occupations. This educational competition produces remarkable intellectual achievements while deepening divisions. Economic development proceeds unevenly as doctrinal disputes disrupt traditional relationships, while creating new opportunities for regions that maintain stability. Dutch independence creates a rival whose merchants challenge Catholic trading networks, while spiritual refugees carry their skills and capital to areas that offer tolerant reception. The coming Great Conflict transforms economic geography as much as boundaries. Rudolf II's reign from 1576 to 1612 exemplifies both the achievements and limitations of late 16th century rulership. His court at Prague becomes a center of learning and artistic patronage that attracts scholars and artists from across Europe, while his personal interests in astronomy and alchemy reflect the period's blending of scientific inquiry with mystical speculation. Yet his withdrawal from practical governance creates a vacuum that ambitious relatives and foreign enemies exploit with devastating effectiveness. Confessional tensions escalate as the Counter-Reformation gains momentum through Jesuit education and diplomatic pressure that seeks to reverse Lutheran gains. The reconversion of several domains to Catholicism demonstrates how spiritual boundaries remain fluid despite legal settlements, while Lutheran resistance hardens into determination to defend gains that represent both conviction and independence from traditional rulers. Defenestration of Prague in 1618 triggers the most devastating struggle in European history, when Bohemian nobles literally throw royal representatives from windows in a gesture that combines theatrical symbolism with deadly serious rebellion. This act of defiance against Habsburg policies escalates into a conflict that will consume Central Europe for 3 decades, while drawing in every major power from Sweden to Spain in struggles that transcend all previous experience. Ferdinand II's election as ruler in 1619 brings to power a sovereign whose Catholic zealotry and dynastic determination create a combustible combination that ignites conflicts across multiple theatres simultaneously. His revocation of concessions in Bohemia triggers uprisings that spread throughout the lands, while his alliance with Catholic League forces creates a powerful coalition dedicated to reversing a century of Lutheran gains through systematic military pressure. Swedish intervention under Gustavus Adolphus transforms doctrinal struggle into international competition for European hegemony. The Lion of the North brings military innovations and Scandinavian resources into Germanic disputes, his victories demonstrating how external powers can exploit internal divisions to advance their own strategic objectives. The death of the Swedish monarch at Lutzen in 1632 removes a crucial Lutheran leader, yet fails to end foreign involvement in Germanic affairs. French participation under Cardinal Richelieu reveals how theological struggle has become a mask for traditional power politics, as Catholic France allies with Lutheran powers against Catholic dominance. This cynical calculation subordinates doctrinal considerations to strategic interests, demonstrating how the spiritual unity that once characterized medieval Christendom has dissolved into competing national organizations that serve dynastic rather than theological masters. Military devastation reaches unprecedented levels as foreign armies ravage regions that have already endured decades of fighting. Population decline in some areas approaches 50% as disease, starvation, and direct violence combine to create demographic catastrophe that will require generations to repair. The social fabric that had supported medieval civilization dissolves under pressures that exceed all previous human experience in their sustained destructiveness. Negotiations begin in 1644, as exhausted combatants recognize that military solutions have become impossible, when all parties possess sufficient resources to continue fighting, yet lack sufficient strength to achieve decisive victory. The diplomatic conference itself becomes a model for future practice, as representatives from across Europe gather to negotiate settlements that will reshape the continental system fundamentally. Settlement in 1648 creates a new European order based on the sovereignty of regional powers rather than the universal dominance of spiritual or dynastic institutions. The treaties recognize the independence of Swiss Confederacy and Dutch Republic, while confirming the autonomy of Germanic domains within a framework that reduces central leadership to ceremonial functions. Doctrinal division receives legal recognition through provisions that extend Augsburg principles while accommodating Calvinist regions. Central leadership emerges from the struggle fatally weakened as regional rulers gain recognition as sovereign powers within their own domains. The crowned head retains ceremonial precedence and certain legal prerogatives, yet effective governance now rests with hundreds of individual rulers, whose domains range from substantial kingdoms to tiny principalities. The medieval dream of universal dominion dies definitively in the smoke of 30 years' devastation. Artistic reconstruction begins even before military struggle ends, as communities attempt to rebuild social institutions destroyed by decades of fighting. Spiritual art flourishes as both Catholic and Lutheran regions seek to express their identities through architectural and artistic projects that demonstrate their survival and continued vitality. The Baroque style emerges as a particularly Catholic response to Lutheran challenges. Economic recovery proves slower than artistic renewal, as disrupted trade relationships require time to re-establish, while devastated agricultural regions struggle to restore productivity. The shift of activity toward Atlantic ports undermines traditional Germanic trading advantages, while New World silver creates inflation that distorts all economic calculations. The economic foundations of dynastic power undergo fundamental transformation. Legal codification accelerates as regional rulers seek to establish systematic governance that reflects their enhanced sovereignty while accommodating local customs that have survived devastation. Roman law influence grows stronger as rulers discover that systematic legal principles provide more effective administration than accumulated traditional privileges that often conflict with practical necessities of governance. Scientific revolution proceeds alongside transformation, as empirical investigation challenges traditional sources in natural philosophy, just as doctrinal revision had challenged ecclesiastical institutions. The development of experimental method and mathematical description of natural phenomena creates new forms of knowledge that transcend traditional boundaries, while providing practical applications that enhance governmental and military effectiveness. The Reich that emerges from the settlement bears little resemblance to the universal realm that Charlemagne established or that Frederick Barbarossa had sought to restore. Yet this transformation represents adaptation to realities that medieval institutions could not accommodate, rather than simple decline from earlier greatness. The new system acknowledges the diversity of European civilization, while providing frameworks for cooperation that anticipate modern diplomatic practice. Cathedral bells ring across 100 domains, with voices that blend harmoniously despite their diversity, creating music that suggests unity, emerging from variety rather than uniformity imposed from above. In these bronze voices lives the promise of a Europe that achieves coordination through negotiation rather than coercion, that preserves local identity while maintaining common civilization, that finds strength in diversity rather than weakness in division. The dream forged by Charlemagne lies in quiet ruin, as the battle-scarred land falls into a hush that speaks louder than victory. The settlement at Westphalia transforms the Holy Roman realm into a legal fiction, a ceremonial framework governing 300 sovereign principalities, whose rulers acknowledge no meaningful superior. What emerges from 30 years of devastation bears the ancient name, yet lacks the substance that once made it the terror and envy of Europe. Leopold I inherits this hollow diadem in 1658, his 60-year reign spanning the twilight of an institution that has outlived its purpose. The young ruler finds himself presiding over domains that function as independent kingdoms, duchies that conduct their own foreign policies, and free cities that mint their own currencies, while paying only ceremonial deference to his supposed supremacy. The regalia still glitters, the coronation ceremonies still inspire awe, yet real governance has devolved to magnates who treat their territories as personal property. Ottoman resurgence under the Köprülü viziers creates the last moment when the old system demonstrates its capacity for coordinated action. The Turkish siege of Vienna in 1683 forces these scattered lords to unite behind their nominal sovereign, their armies converging on the Danube to repel an Islamic threat that had haunted European nightmares for centuries. The victory achieved through this cooperation briefly resurrects dreams of renewed unity, yet the triumph proves Pyrrhic, as successful commanders return home more convinced than ever of their own importance. French expansion under Louis XIV reveals how completely the balance of European might has shifted away from central leadership. The Sun King's armies advance inexorably eastward, annexing Alsace and Lorraine, while the supposed protector of Germanic liberties can only watch helplessly. The War of the Spanish Succession demonstrates that France, not the moribund Reich, now sets the tempo of continental affairs, while English naval power determines global commercial relationships that dwarf traditional territorial considerations. Administrative evolution adapts to realities as rulers develop new mechanisms for managing fragmented sovereignty. The Eternal Diet sitting permanently at Regensburg becomes a diplomatic conference rather than a legislative assembly, its proceedings conducted through formal protocols that obscure the absence of meaningful central command. Delegates debate precedents and ceremony, while their masters negotiate military alliances and commercial agreements that ignore traditional hierarchies entirely. Artistic flowering, paradoxically, accompanies decline, as competing courts seek to demonstrate their sophistication through patronage and intellectual achievement. The Baroque reaches its zenith in Germanic lands where Catholic lords commission magnificent palaces and churches that rival Versailles in their splendor. Lutheran regions develop different aesthetic approaches that emphasize restraint and functionality, yet both produce remarkable achievements that testify to the vitality of local cultures freed from central control. Economic transformation proceeds through commercial revolution that connects Germanic territories to global trading networks while undermining traditional relationships between rulers and subjects. The rise of banking houses, like the Fuggers, creates new forms of wealth that transcend boundaries, while colonial trade generates revenues that flow to Atlantic ports rather than traditional inland centers. Population recovery from wartime devastation enables agricultural expansion that supports growing urban populations engaged in manufacturing and commerce. Charles VI's pragmatic sanction attempts to solve the succession crisis that threatens to tear the Austrian domains apart when the male line faces extinction. His efforts to secure recognition for his daughter, Maria Theresa's inheritance, consume decades of diplomatic effort, while revealing how completely the old Reich has fragmented into competing power centers. The document's acceptance by the Diet proves meaningless when Frederick the Great of Prussia simply ignores it to seize Silesia in 1740. Conflict over Austrian inheritance exposes the hollow nature of traditional obligations, as lords calculate their interests according to immediate advantages rather than ancient loyalties. Frederick's aggression succeeds because no mechanism exists to enforce collective security among sovereign equals who recognize no superior command. The struggle reshapes Central European geography while confirming that military strength, not legal precedent, determines outcomes in the emerging state system. Maria Theresa's battle to defend her inheritance demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of enlightened leadership within the evolving framework. Her administrative innovations strengthen Austrian territories, while her marriage to Francis of Lorraine maintains the fiction of male rule that legal customs require. Yet her efforts to create effective governance founder against the constraints inherited from centuries of constitutional compromise that privilege local autonomy over central efficiency. 7 Years' War transforms European affairs by establishing Prussia as a major power capable of challenging Austrian dominance within Germanic territories. Frederick the Great's survival against a coalition that includes France, Austria, and Russia proves that military excellence can overcome numerical disadvantages when supported by efficient administration and popular loyalty. The conflict's outcome creates a dualism that will dominate Germanic affairs until both monarchies fall to democratic forces. Philosophical ideas penetrate Germanic courts through intellectual networks that transcend boundaries, bringing new concepts of leadership that challenge traditional assumptions about divine right and hereditary privilege. Rulers like Joseph II attempt to implement rational changes based on philosophical principles rather than accumulated precedent, yet their efforts encounter resistance from subjects who prefer familiar customs to abstract improvements imposed from above. Joseph II's revolutionary program seeks to transform his inherited territories into a centralized state based on reason rather than custom. His abolition of serfdom, religious toleration, and administrative rationalization anticipate later democratic developments, yet founder against the practical difficulties of governing diverse populations whose languages, customs, and interests resist homogenization. His death in 1790 brings reaction that reverses many innovations, while preserving others that prove compatible with local interests. Democratic explosion in France sends shockwaves throughout Germanic lands as radical ideologies challenge the fundamental assumptions underlying aristocratic rule. The execution of Louis XVI demonstrates that even the most ancient thrones rest on foundations less solid than previously assumed, while democratic armies prove that popular enthusiasm can overcome professional military forces trained in conventional tactics. Coalition wars against France reveal the Reich's complete inability to defend its own territories, as democratic armies advance across the Rhine to liberate populations supposedly oppressed by feudal obligations. The ease of French conquest demonstrates how little loyalty the old system commanded among populations who welcome foreign invaders as liberators from domestic tyrants. Traditional Germanic military organization proves incapable of resisting forces motivated by ideological conviction rather than dynastic obligation. Bonaparte's rise transforms European affairs through the creation of satellite states that ignore traditional boundaries while implementing administrative innovations that anticipate modern governmental practice. The Rhineland Alliance, established in 1806, offers Germanic lords an alternative to the moribund Reich that promises greater efficiency and international respectability. 16 major rulers abandon their ancient allegiances to join the French system, their defection making the traditional framework untenable. Francis II faces the ultimate humiliation when the French leader offers protection to Germanic lords against their nominal sovereign. The choice becomes stark: maintain meaningless dignity while losing all practical influence, or acknowledge reality by dissolving arrangements that no longer serve any useful purpose. The Austrian ruler's decision to abdicate his traditional title while retaining his hereditary territories preserves dynastic interests while accepting the inevitable. Final ceremony unfolds with tragic dignity as Francis II announces the dissolution of the Holy Roman Realm on August 6, 1806. The formal declaration acknowledges what reality had already accomplished: the transformation of a 1,000-year institution into an antiquated formality whose continuation would only embarrass its participants. The regalia disappears into storage, while the last shadows of Charlemagne's legacy fade into historical memory. Immediate consequences extend far beyond Germanic territories, as the elimination of the Reich's legal framework forces a complete reconstruction of Central European affairs. The Congress of Vienna attempts to create new arrangements that preserve legitimate interests while acknowledging the impossibility of restoring traditional relationships that the democratic period has destroyed beyond repair. The Germanic alliance that emerges represents compromise between Austrian and Prussian ambitions, rather than revival of medieval universalism. Historical assessment reveals the Reich's transformation rather than simple decline, its evolution from medieval universalism through early modern confederalism to final dissolution, reflecting broader changes in European civilization that no institution could have resisted. The dream of universal monarchy died not through failure, but through success. The very prosperity and development that it fostered made its continuation unnecessary and ultimately impossible. Artistic achievement survives institutional dissolution, as Germanic accomplishments in philosophy, music, literature, and science transcend the arrangements that originally nurtured them. The universities that medieval rulers founded continue producing scholarship that influences global intellectual development, while aesthetic approaches developed in princely courts find new expressions in democratic societies that value individual creativity over hierarchical patronage. Legal inheritance proves equally durable as principles developed through centuries of constitutional experimentation influence modern federal systems that seek to balance central coordination with local autonomy. The Reich's final contribution to constitutional development lies not in its institutional forms, but in its demonstration that complex societies can maintain unity while preserving diversity, can achieve cooperation while respecting independence. Educational systems preserve what administrative arrangements could not sustain, as schools and universities continue teaching the philosophical and scientific achievements that flourished under the Reich's protection. The humanistic learning that Germanic scholars pioneered spreads throughout European civilization, carrying forward intellectual traditions that transcend the boundaries and loyalties that originally shaped them. Architectural monuments scattered across Central Europe testify to the creative energies that the Reich's complex structure fostered over centuries of competitive patronage. Gothic cathedrals and Baroque palaces demonstrate how the system's very fragmentation encouraged artistic innovation, as competing courts sought to outdo their rivals through magnificent building programs that employed the finest artists and craftsmen. Musical traditions developed in Germanic territories continue enriching global culture long after the institutional arrangements that supported them have vanished. The polyphonic complexity that characterized court music finds expression in the works of Bach and Mozart, whose compositions reflect the sophisticated synthesis of diverse influences that the Reich's international character made possible. Technological innovations pioneered in Germanic workshops and laboratories contribute to the scientific revolution that transforms European civilization during the early modern period. The printing press, mechanical clocks, and metallurgical techniques developed in Germanic territories spread throughout the world, demonstrating how the Reich's commercial networks facilitated the exchange of knowledge and techniques across vast distances. Commercial practices developed by Germanic merchants influenced the emergence of modern capitalism, as banking techniques, insurance methods, and international trading procedures spread from centers like Augsburg and Frankfurt to financial capitals throughout Europe. The Hanseatic League's organizational principles anticipate later forms of international cooperation that transcend national boundaries. Memory preserves what reality could not sustain as the Holy Roman realm enters historical consciousness as symbol of possibilities that transcend immediate practical limitations. In the music of Bach and Mozart, in the philosophy of Kant and Hegel, in the architecture of countless cathedrals and palaces, the achievements that flourished under the Reich's protection continue enriching human civilization long after the arrangements that enabled them have vanished. Philosophical speculation about the Reich's meaning continues influencing European thought, as later thinkers attempt to understand how such a complex and seemingly unwieldy institution could survive for 1,000 years, while contributing so significantly to European development. The Reich becomes a model for federal arrangements that seek to combine unity with diversity, demonstrating that effective governance need not require uniformity or centralization. Romantic nostalgia transforms the Reich into a symbol of organic development and traditional wisdom, opposed to the mechanical rationality and revolutionary disruption that characterizes modern democratic societies. Writers and artists idealize the medieval period as an age of faith and community that offered spiritual satisfactions unavailable in the materialistic and individualistic world that replaced it. Regional identities shaped by centuries of Reich membership persist long after formal dissolution, as populations maintain cultural characteristics that reflect their historical participation in the broader Germanic community. Local customs, architectural styles, and social practices preserve memories of the complex relationships that once linked diverse territories in common allegiance to the ancient crown. Church bells ring for the last time across territories that will never again acknowledge common allegiance, their bronze voices carrying echoes of Charlemagne's Christmas coronation through centuries that have witnessed the rise and fall of the greatest experiment in European unity before the modern age. In their fading music lives the memory of dreams that dared to envision universal peace through shared governance, common law, and mutual respect among peoples whose diversity enriched rather than weakened their civilization. The ancient diadem rests silent in its vault, its jewels catching light that illuminates nothing, its gold reflecting glory that belongs to ages past. Yet somewhere in the German forests where it all began, in the Italian cities where it achieved its greatest triumphs, in the memories of all who still believe that unity and diversity can coexist, the spirit of the Holy Roman realm endures, not as administrative reality, but as eternal aspiration toward the possibility of human governance that serves justice rather than mere power, wisdom rather than simple strength,